10,000 years on the throne, and it ended in a single afternoon. The House Corrino had governed the known universe for longer than most civilizations had existed. 10 millennia of unbroken dynastic authority, sustained through the most sophisticated combination of military force, political architecture, and institutional management that the human species had ever produced. The Padishah Emperors of the known universe, the title itself, carried the weight of ages, the accumulated legitimacy of a house whose claim to rule had been validated by the sheer duration of the ruling. 10,000 years. 400 generations. A dynasty so old that the memory of its founding had passed from history into mythology, that the political landscape it administered had been shaped so thoroughly by its administration that the landscape and the dynasty were indistinguishable. And then a boy from the desert, riding a sandworm at the head of an army of fanatics, took it from them in an afternoon. This is the story of House Corrino. Not simply the story of the dynasty's fall, though the fall was dramatic enough to deserve the telling on its own terms. The story of the rise, the maintenance, the institutional architecture that sustained the longest continuous governance in human history, and the specific combination of arrogance and miscalculation that brought the architecture down. The story of what it meant to hold the throne of the known universe for 10,000 years, and what it cost, and what the holding produced, and why the production eventually included the conditions for the holding's end. The Corrino dynasty emerged from the aftermath of the Battle of Corrin, the military engagement that ended the Butlerian Jihad and that gave the house both its name and its claim to the throne. The jihad had been the defining crisis of human civilization. The crusade against the thinking machines, the artificial intelligences that humanity had created and that had become. In the jihad's theological and political framing, a threat to human identity itself had lasted for generations and had consumed the political and military resources of the human species with a thoroughness that left the post-jihad landscape fundamentally different from anything that had preceded it. The Battle of Corrin was the jihad's conclusion, the military engagement that broke the thinking machine's power and that established the political order that would govern the known universe for the next 10,000 years. The human forces that fought at Corrin were organized under the leadership that the jihad's military demands had produced, and the leadership that emerged from the battle's victory was the leadership that would claim the right to govern the post-jihad civilization. The Corrino claim to the throne was a claim of military leadership. The house had been prominent in the jihad's military campaigns, had provided the command that the battle's decisive phase required, had been positioned through the jihad's political dynamics and through the house's own ambition to emerge from the victory as the faction with the strongest claim to the authority that the victory had created. The claim was not uncontested. The post-Corrin political landscape included multiple factions whose contributions to the jihad had been significant and whose claims to authority were not obviously inferior to the Corrinos. The great convention that followed the jihad, the political settlement that established the framework for the post-jihad order, was not the simple coronation of the Corrino house. It was a negotiation conducted among factions whose military capability made negotiation necessary, and whose competing claims to authority had to be accommodated within whatever framework the settlement produced. The framework was the tripod. The political architecture that the Great Convention established, the balance of power among the Emperor, the Landsraad, and the Spacing Guild, was the settlement's most durable product. The architecture acknowledged the competing claims by distributing authority among the three legs. The Emperor held the executive authority and the military force. The Landsraad held the collective political representation of the noble houses. and the Guild held a navigational monopoly that made interstellar civilization possible. The Corrinos held the Emperor's leg. This gave them the throne, the Sardaukar, the administrative authority of the imperial government, and the position at the center of the political system that the tripod defined. It did not give them absolute power. The tripod was designed to prevent absolute power, to ensure that any two legs could combine to check the power of the third. That no single institution could dominate the political landscape without the acquiescence or the inability of the other two to prevent it. The Corrinos understood the tripod's constraints from the beginning, and the dynasty's durability was, in significant part, the product of the house's sustained understanding of what the constraints permitted and what they did not. The Sardaukar were the Corrino dynasty's most important institutional asset, and understanding the Sardaukar is essential for understanding how the dynasty maintained its position across 10,000 years. The Sardaukar were the Emperor's military force, not simply a military force in the sense of an organized body of soldiers available for deployment, but the military force, the single most capable conventional fighting force in the known universe, the instrument of imperial authority whose capability exceeded what any other military tradition in the Imperium could produce. The capability was produced through conditions. This is the most important thing to understand about the Sardaukar, because the conditions were the thing that made the Sardaukar what they were, and the thing that the Corrinos managed with the most deliberate attention across the centuries of the dynasty's reign. Seleucia Secundus was the Corrino prison planet. Officially, it was a penal colony, a world where the Imperium's most dangerous criminals were sent to serve their sentences in conditions that the criminal justice system's most severe dispositions required. The planet's environment was harsh. Not as harsh as Arrakis, but harsh enough that the survival rate among the prison population was low, and the survivors were hardened by the conditions that the non-survivors had not endured. The prison was also the training ground. This was the secret, not deeply hidden, not entirely unknown to the Imperium's more perceptive political actors, but maintained with sufficient deniability that the knowledge did not become the political problem that open acknowledgement would have created. The conditions on Seleucia Secundus that served as the punishment for criminals also served as the selection process for soldiers. The prisoners who survived the planet's conditions, who endured the environment's harshness and the social environment's brutality, and emerged from the experience capable of functioning under conditions that would have broken less resilient individuals. These survivors were the Sardaukar's recruitment pool. The selection was environmental rather than institutional. The Sardaukar did not select candidates through the kind of formal assessment process that most military traditions employed. The environment selected them. The planet's conditions, the climate, the ecology, the social dynamics of a prison population operating under minimal governance functioned as a filter that eliminated the incapable and identified the capable through the straightforward mechanism of survival. The people who survived Seleucia Secundus were, by the fact of their survival, demonstrated to possess the physical resilience, the psychological toughness, and the capacity for functioning under extreme conditions that the Sardaukar's military role required. The training that followed the environmental selection refined what the selection had identified. The survivors who were recruited into the Sardaukar Corps received military training that was among the most demanding in the Imperium, training that took the environmental hardening the planet had produced and developed it into military capability through the application of the technical instruction and the tactical education that the Sardaukar tradition had refined across centuries. The result was a military force whose individual soldiers exceeded the capability of any other military tradition's soldiers by a significant margin. The Sardaukar were not simply well-trained. They were forged, shaped by conditions so demanding that the shaping itself constituted a capability that training alone could not replicate. The environmental selection produced a baseline of physical and psychological resilience that the military training then developed into the combat effectiveness that the Sardaukar were known for. The Corrino dynasty's management of the Sardaukar was the dynasty's most consequential institutional decision maintained across the full span of the 10,000-year reign. The management included the maintenance of Seleucia Secundus as a prison planet, the sustained provision of the environmental conditions that the Sardaukar's production required. The management included the secrecy, the deniability that kept the relationship between the prison conditions and the military capability from becoming public knowledge that the Landsraad could use against the dynasty. The management included the deployment protocols, the strategic decisions about when and how the Sardaukar were used, the calibration of their deployment to the political situations that required military force, without the political consequences that excessive or visible deployment would have produced. The Sardaukar were the dynasty's enforcement mechanism. When the tripod's balance was threatened, when a Landsraad house became too powerful, when a political faction's ambitions exceeded what the existing order could accommodate, when the political dynamics produced a situation that the diplomatic mechanisms could not resolve, the Sardaukar were the instrument that resolved it. Not always through direct military engagement, the Sardaukar's capability was itself a political tool, the threat of deployment serving the same function as actual deployment in many of the situations where the threat was sufficient. The threat's credibility depended on the Sardaukar's demonstrated capability, and the capability was demonstrated periodically through the military engagements that the dynasty's political management could not avoid. The engagements were calibrated. The Corrinos did not deploy the Sardaukar for trivial purposes, did not waste the military capital that each deployment consumed, did not allow the force's capability to be assessed by potential opponents through engagements that provided tactical information without strategic benefit. The Sardaukar were deployed when the deployment was necessary and were kept in reserve when the reserve served the political purpose better than the deployment would have. This management, the sustained, careful, strategically informed management of the most capable military force in the known universe, was the Corrino dynasty's primary institutional competence, and the competence was maintained across the 10,000-year span of the dynasty's reign through the institutional culture that the dynasty developed and transmitted from generation to generation. The Chom framework was the dynasty's second most important institutional asset, and the relationship between the throne and the commercial infrastructure that Chom represented was the economic dimension of the Corrino power that the Sardaukar's military dimension complemented. Chom, the Combine Honnet Ober Advancer Mercantiles, was the Imperium's commercial organization, the framework within which the production, distribution, and consumption of the known universe's goods and services were organized. Joham was not a Corrino institution, it was a shared framework, with shareholding distributed among the Imperium's major actors, the Emperor, the Landsraad houses, the Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, and the other institutions whose economic contributions the framework managed. The Emperor held the largest Chom shareholding. This was the economic expression of the political authority the throne represented, the commercial power that accompanied the administrative authority, the economic leverage that supplemented the military leverage the Sardaukar provided. The Emperor's Chom position gave the dynasty influence over the Imperium's economic arrangements that exceeded what any other single actor could exercise, and the influence was deployed in service of the dynasty's political objectives with the same strategic attention that characterized the management of the Sardaukar. The spice was the economic relationship that connected everything. The melange, produced exclusively on Arrakis, consumed throughout the Imperium, the most valuable commodity in the known universe's economy, was the substance around which the Chom framework's most consequential economic relationships were organized. The Emperor's management of the Arrakis fief assignment, the determination of which noble house would govern the planet and manage the spice production, was the throne's most important economic decision, because the spice production's revenue was the largest single component of the Imperium's economic output, and the governance of its production was the most consequential commercial responsibility. The Chom framework contained. The Corrinos managed the Arrakis assignment as a political tool rather than as a simple economic decision. The house that governed Arrakis controlled the spice production, and the control of the spice production was the most powerful economic position in the Imperium. The assignment of this position was the throne's most valuable political gift. The reward that the Emperor could bestow on a loyal house, the punishment that the Emperor could impose on a disloyal one by withdrawing it, the instrument through which the Emperor managed the Landsraad's internal dynamics by determining which house received the economic benefit of the spice governance and which house did not. The Harkonnens had held the Arrakis assignment for 80 years before the events of Dune. The assignment's duration reflected the Harkonnens' usefulness to the Corrino political strategy. The Baron's house paid its imperial taxes reliably, maintained the spice production at levels the Chom framework required, and managed the political complications of the Arrakis governance without creating problems that the throne had to address. The Harkonnens were effective managers. They were not pleasant managers. The governance style was exploitative, the population was oppressed, the Fremen were treated as a nuisance to be contained rather than a civilization to be accommodated. But the management produced the spice, and the spice was what the throne's economic interest required. The reassignment of Arrakis from the Harkonnens to the Atreides was the decision that would eventually destroy the Corrino dynasty, and examining the decision's logic is essential for understanding why the dynasty fell. But before examining the decision's fatal logic, two additional dimensions of the dynasty's institutional operation deserve attention. The Corrino dynasty's relationship with the Spacing Guild was the political dimension that most directly constrained the dynasty's freedom of action and that most thoroughly shaped the governance's strategic calculations. The Guild was the third leg of the tripod, and the third leg's relationship with the first was defined by mutual dependency and mutual wariness. The Emperor depended on the Guild for the interstellar transportation the governance required, military deployments, administrative communications, economic traffic. The Guild depended on the Emperor for the political stability, the spice supplies reliability required, the management of Arrakis, the enforcement of the order within which the spice production operated. The dependency was mutual, but not equal. The Emperor could not replace the Guild. No alternative to the Guild's navigational capability existed. The Ixian machines were centuries from matching the navigator's prescient perception, and the prohibition against thinking machines prevented the development of computational alternatives. The Emperor was locked into the Guild's service, and the lock was structural. The Guild could, in principle, withdraw its support. Not by taking the throne, the Guild's institutional culture did not aspire to political governance. By transferring its services to a challenger, by using the transportation monopoly's leverage to shape the political landscape in ways that served the Guild's interests rather than the dynasty's. The Guild did not do this. The Guild's institutional conservatism, its commitment to maintaining the conditions under which the spice supply was reliable, produced the assessment that the existing order served the Guild's interests better than any alternative. The assessment was maintained across the millennia, because Corrino governance, whatever its other qualities, provided the political stability the guild's operations required. But the possibility of the guild's defection was present in the political landscape structure, and the dynasty managed it through sustained attention. The management included favourable chone terms. It included accommodation of the guild's neutrality, tolerance of the guild's service to the dynasty's enemies alongside its service to the dynasty. It included careful avoidance of the kinds of political disruption that might trigger the guild's reassessment of the existing order. The conspiracy against the Atreides was the kind of disruption the management was supposed to prevent. The guild's cooperation was limited to transportation. The guild did not participate in the planning or execution beyond its standard service. The guild's indifference protected the dynasty during the conspiracy's execution and became the dynasty's vulnerability during the consequences. The guild served Paul with the same indifference it served the emperor, which meant Paul's military capability was not constrained by the transportation limitations a guild allied with the dynasty might have imposed. The Corrino dynasty's relationship with Arrakis extended across the full 10,000 years, and the planet that produced the spice was managed through a succession of fief assignments whose political logic illuminated the quality of the dynasty's governance. Arrakis had not always been governed by the Harkonnens. The 80-year Harkonnen tenure was the latest in a long sequence of assignments managed across the millennia. The planet had been governed by various houses, each assignment reflecting the political calculations the dynasty's governance of the fief system produced. The assignment was political rather than administrative. The decision about which house governed Arrakis was a calculation about which house's governance served the dynasty's interests, which house's enrichment produced the preferred political consequences, which house's management generated the least complication for the throne. The planet that had been the dynasty's most important economic asset became, in the conspiracy against the Atreides, the dynasty's most important political weapon. The transformation from asset to weapon was the transformation that produced the fall, because the weapon's deployment produced consequences the asset's management had never generated. The Corrino house, during the God Emperor's 3,000-year reign, experienced the managed existence every institution shared. And the experience illustrates what sustained institutional survival looked like under total external management. The house maintained itself on whatever territories the God Emperor's governance permitted. The maintenance was minimal, not wealthy, not politically significant, not militarily capable. Beyond the household security the managed conditions allowed, the house existed because the God Emperor chose not to eliminate it. The Sardaukar remnant continued to train. The Corrino tradition's military apparatus produced soldiers who carried the Sardaukar heritage into the managed period, not the force of the dynasty's peak, but soldiers who maintained the tradition's knowledge and practices. The institutional memory was the house's primary asset, 10,000 years of governance knowledge, preserved through the training apparatus and the institutional practices the house continued to perform. The maintenance of knowledge without opportunity for deployment was the managed period's particular challenge. The house waited. The house preserved. The institutional culture said, the conditions will change, and when they change, the knowledge will be available. The patience was tested across 3,500 years, a duration that exceeded the dynasty's own reign. The Corrino institutional culture, developed to sustain governance across millennia, was tested by the duration of non-governance the managed period imposed. The culture survived the testing. When the God Emperor died and the managed conditions ended, the Corrino institutional culture remained, still carrying the accumulated knowledge, still maintaining the institutional identity, still preserving the governance tradition the dynasty's 10,000 years of practice had produced. Whether the survived culture was still relevant to the conditions the post-God Emperor era produced was a different question. One that the scattering's dispersal would carry into the uncharted dark along with everything else. Shaddam IV was the last Corrino emperor, and his reign was the culmination and the destruction of everything the dynasty had built across 10,000 years. Shaddam was not a fool. This bears stating directly because the popular understanding of the character, shaped by the dramatic events that ended his reign, tends to present him as a political incompetent who was outmaneuvered by a 15-year-old boy and whose dynasty's collapse was the inevitable consequence of his own stupidity. The reading is wrong. Shaddam IV was an experienced political operator who had inherited and maintained the most complex political position in the known universe, who had managed the tripod's balance with the competence that the position required, who understood the Landsraad's dynamics and the Sardaukar's capabilities and the economic relationships of the Chom framework, with the depth that decades of governance had developed. He was also afraid, and the fear was the thing that made him dangerous in a way that his intelligence alone would not have made him. The fear was of House Atreides. Not of the Atreides' military capability. The Atreides' forces were respectable but not formidable by the standards of the Imperium's larger military establishments. Not of the Atreides' economic position. The Caladan fief was productive but not dominant. The fear was of the Atreides' political position, the reputation, the respect, the quality of governance that the Atreides' tradition represented, and that the Landsraad's political culture recognized as something that the Corrino tradition, for all its institutional durability, could not match. Duke Leto Atreides was popular. The word sounds small in the context of interstellar politics, but the reality it described was large enough to threaten the dynasty. Leto was popular in the Landsraad, respected by the other houses for the quality of his governance, for the personal integrity that his political conduct demonstrated, for the loyalty his people showed to a house that had earned its people's attachment through service rather than through compulsion. Leto was the kind of ruler that the Landsraad's political culture admired most, the noble who governed well, who treated his retainers with respect, who conducted his political business with the straightforward honesty that most of the Landsraad's members aspired to in their public rhetoric and failed to practice in their private conduct. The admiration was political, not simply personal, not just the Landsraad's members liking Leto as a person, though they did. Political. The recognition that Leto's governance represented a model that was different from the Corrino model, that the Atreides tradition's commitment to governance as service was a viable alternative to the Corrino tradition's practice of governance as the management of a system for the benefit of the system's managers. The admiration was, in its political dimension, a judgment, the judgment that the Atreides way was better, that a ruler who governed as Leto governed would be preferable to a ruler who governed as the Corrinos governed. This judgment was the threat. A Landsraad that admired an alternative to the dynasty was a Landsraad that might, under the right circumstances, act on the admiration, might rally behind the alternative, might support the displacement of the dynasty by the house that the admiration identified as superior. The judgment did not have to be acted on to be dangerous. The judgment's existence, the presence in the political landscape of a widespread, well-founded assessment that there was a better alternative to the current ruler, was itself a structural threat to the dynasty's position. Shaddam assessed this threat with the precision that his political training had developed, and his assessment concluded that the threat had to be eliminated. not managed. The diplomatic tools that the Corrino tradition had developed for the management of political threats were not adequate for a threat of this nature, because the threat was not a policy disagreement or a territorial dispute that negotiation could resolve. The threat was the existence of a house whose qualities made the Landsraad question whether the dynasty deserved the throne. The threat could not be negotiated away. It could only be eliminated by eliminating the house that embodied it. The Arrakis trap was Shaddam's solution, and the solution's elegance reflected the quality of the mind that designed it. The transfer of the Arrakis fief from the Harkonnens to the Atreides was presented as a routine administrative reassignment, the kind of fief transfer that the Imperium's governance included as a standard mechanism, and that the Landsraad's political culture accepted without alarm. The presentation was essential. The transfer had to look normal. It had to appear to be what the political system's existing mechanisms produced rather than what the Emperor's political strategy had designed, because the appearance of normalcy was the thing that prevented the Landsraad from recognizing the trap for what it was. The trap's logic was sophisticated. The transfer placed the Atreides on Arrakis, placed them on a world where the spice production's economic significance made the governance inherently dangerous, where the Fremen's unassessed military capability created security challenges the Atreides were not prepared for, where the Harkonnens' 80 years of established presence meant that the institutional infrastructure was organized against the Atreides rather than in their favor. The transfer placed the Atreides in danger. The danger was not the trap. The danger was the context. The trap was the military force that would be applied to the Atreides while they were in the dangerous context, the Sardaukar, deployed in Harkonnen livery, participating in the Harkonnen assault under the disguise that prevented the attack from being recognized as the imperial action it was. The disguise was the critical element. The Sardaukar in Harkonnen livery were not simply a military force concealing its identity. They were the dynasty's plausible deniability, the mechanism that allowed Shaddam to destroy the Atreides through military force, while maintaining the appearance that the destruction was a Harkonnen action rather than an imperial one. The Landsraad could not object to a conflict between two noble houses. The political system included provisions for inter-house conflict, and the Atreides' destruction at the Harkonnens' hands, however tragic, was within the system's parameters. The Landsraad could object to the Emperor using the Sardaukar to destroy a noble house. That was an action outside the system's parameters, a violation of the political framework that the dynasty's legitimacy depended on. The disguise was therefore the thing that made the conspiracy possible. Without it, the destruction of the Atreides would have been an imperial action that the Landsraad would have been obligated to respond to. With it, the destruction was a Harkonnen action that the Landsraad would deplore, but would not be required to treat as a constitutional crisis. The Baron Harkonnen was the co-conspirator whose participation made the plan operationally feasible. The Baron provided the Harkonnen forces that would conduct the assault's visible dimension, the forces that would be identified as the attackers, that would provide the cover under which the Sardaukar operated, that would manage the assault's logistics and the post-assault governance. The Baron's motivation was straightforward. The destruction of the Atreides served the Harkonnen interest regardless of what it did for the Emperor, and the recovery of the Arrakis fief, the resumption of the spice governance that the Baron had been forced to relinquish as part of the trap's setup, was the economic reward that the Baron's participation secured. The conspiracy's operational dimension, the coordination of the imperial and Harkonnen military assets, the management of the Yueh betrayal that provided the inside access the assault required, the timing that synchronized the military action with the political cover, was managed with the competence that both the emperors and the barons' political operations could provide. The plan was well designed. The execution was well managed. The immediate result was what the conspiracy was designed to produce: the destruction of House Atreides. The conspiracy's success was immediate and its failure was eventual, and the gap between the immediate success and the eventual failure is the space in which the Corrino dynasty's fall occurred. The immediate success, the Atreides were destroyed. Duke Leto was dead. The household was scattered. The military capability that the Atreides had maintained on Caladan was eliminated or dispersed. The political position that had made the Atreides the most admired house in the Landsraad was, in the immediate aftermath of the assault, destroyed along with the house that had embodied it. The eventual failure: Paul survived. Jessica survived. They survived in the desert among the Fremen in conditions that the conspiracy's planning had not accounted for, because the conspiracy's intelligence had not assessed the Fremen's capability or the desert's capacity for hiding the survivors of the assault. The failure was an intelligence failure. This is the dimension that the political analysis of the Corrino fall tends to underemphasize, because the intelligence failure was not dramatic, was not the result of a spy's betrayal or a communication intercept or any of the conventional forms of intelligence failure that the political narrative's dramatic requirements favored. The intelligence failure was an assessment failure. The conspiracy's planners, both the emperors and the barons, had not assessed the Fremen's capability correctly, had not understood the desert's capacity for concealing survivors, had not anticipated that the people who survived the assault would find in the desert a population capable of providing the military, political, and social support that the survivors' continued existence required. The Fremen were the variable the conspiracy had not accounted for. Not because the Fremen were unknown, the Imperium was aware of the Fremen's existence, and the Harkonnen intelligence apparatus had been dealing with the Fremen as a governance challenge for 80 years. Because the Fremen were underestimated. The assessment of the Fremen's capability, the evaluation of their numbers, their military training, their organizational sophistication, their potential as a political and military force was wrong. Wrong by a margin that would prove catastrophic for the conspiracy's long-term objectives. The assessment was wrong because the assessors were not looking at the Fremen as a civilization. They were looking at the Fremen as a population, a group of people who inhabited the desert and who caused logistical problems for the spice operation. The distinction mattered because the assessment framework determined what the assessors were looking for, and the framework that assessed populations was looking for different things from the framework that assessed civilizations. A population had numbers and location. A civilization had capability and culture and organizational depth and the capacity for collective action that individual numbers did not capture. The Fremen were a civilization, millions strong, militarily trained to a standard that exceeded the Sardaukar, organizationally sophisticated enough to maintain the terraforming program in the Sietch communities and the water discipline that constituted the most demanding collective social discipline any population in the Imperium maintained. Culturally united by the religious traditions and the survival practices that the desert had forged across millennia of desert existence. None of this was visible to the conspiracy's intelligence apparatus, because the intelligence apparatus was not designed to see it. The Harkonnen intelligence assessed the Fremen through the lens of the spice operations logistics. How many Fremen were in this area? What disruptions they might cause to the harvesting, what security measures the operation needed to manage the Fremen's interference. The imperial intelligence assessed the Fremen through the lens of the planetary governance's administrative requirements, population estimates for the census, resource allocation for the governance's budget. The kind of surface-level assessment that the administrative framework generated and that the administrative framework's users assumed was complete. The Spacing Guild had been helping to conceal the Fremen's true numbers. The Guild's cooperation with the Fremen's bribery arrangement had maintained blind spots in the satellite surveillance that kept the deep desert populations invisible to the administrative assessment. The concealment was not the conspiracy's fault, but the concealment's existence demonstrated the inadequacy of the intelligence on which the conspiracy's planning was based. The conspiracy was designed to destroy a noble house. The conspiracy had not been designed to deal with the civilization that the noble house's survivors would find in the desert. The 2 years that Paul and Jessica spent in the desert were the 2 years in which the Corrino dynasty's position deteriorated from dominant to vulnerable, though the deterioration was not visible from the throne's perspective during the period in which it was occurring. Shaddam's assessment of the post-assault situation was that the conspiracy had succeeded. The Atreides were destroyed. The Arrakis fief had been restored to the Harkonnens, who were resuming the spice governance that the transfer had temporarily interrupted. The political landscape was adjusting to the Atreides' removal. The Landsraad was processing the loss of its most admired member with a mixture of regret and adaptation that the political system's dynamics produced in response to any house's destruction. The conspiracies cover the presentation of the destruction as a Harkonnen action rather than an imperial one was holding. The throne did not know that Paul was alive. This was the intelligence gap that would prove fatal. The conspiracy's planning had assumed that the assault's completeness would eliminate the Atreides bloodline along with the Atreides political position. The planning had not included contingencies for the survival of the Atreides heir, because the planning's assessment of the desert's lethality had concluded that survival in the deep desert was not possible for people who were not adapted to its conditions. Paul was adapting. He was adapting with the Fremen's help, and with the capabilities that his Bene Gesserit training and his Atreides heritage and his genetic potential provided. He was developing the prescient faculty that the spice saturation was activating. He was building the relationship with the Fremen that would eventually transform the desert population into the military force that would destroy the Corrino position. Shaddam did not know this was happening. The intelligence from Arrakis, fragmentary, filtered through the Harkonnen governance's information management, distorted by the Baron's interest in presenting the governance as successful, did not include the information that would have alerted the throne to the threat that was building in the desert. The report said, the spice production is proceeding. The Fremen are being managed. The planet's governance is under control. The reports were wrong. The governance was not under control. The Fremen were not being managed. They were organizing, under Paul's leadership, into the military force that the governance's assessment had not anticipated. The spice production was proceeding, but the conditions under which it was proceeding were changing in ways that the reports did not capture. The intelligence failure was compounding. Each report that failed to identify the threat allowed the threat to develop further. Each month of the 2-year gap was a month in which the Fremen military capability grew, and the throne's awareness of the growth did not. The gap between the reality on Arrakis and the throne's understanding of the reality was widening. And the widening was producing the conditions for the catastrophe that the gap would eventually generate. The battle for Arrakeen was the afternoon in which 10,000 years ended. The Fremen assault Paul's forces, organized and trained and motivated by the combination of military capability and religious fervor that the desert period had produced, hit the combined Harkonnen and Sardaukar defenses with a speed and a ferocity that exceeded what any military planning the defenders possessed had anticipated. The sandworm cavalry charge through the breached shield wall was the battle's most dramatic element, but the battle's outcome was determined before the charge by the fundamental disparity between what the defenders expected and what they encountered. The defenders expected a desert insurgency, a guerrilla force, capable of harassment and sabotage, but not of the kind of conventional military engagement that could threaten a fortified position defended by Sardaukar. What they encountered was an army, a trained, organized, motivated military force whose individual soldiers' capability exceeded the Sardaukars and whose collective organization was sufficient for the kind of sustained assault that the fortified position's defense required. The Sardaukars' defeat was the battle's most consequential element for the dynasty's future. The Sardaukar had been the Corrino dynasty's enforcement mechanism for 10,000 years, the military force whose capability exceeded any other force in the Imperium and whose capabilities demonstrated superiority was the foundation of the dynasty's military legitimacy. The Fremen's victory over the Sardaukar was not simply a military defeat. It was the destruction of the dynasty's military foundation, the demonstration that the force the dynasty had relied on for 10,000 years was no longer the supreme military capability in the known universe. Shaddam was on Arrakis when the battle occurred. The Emperor had come to Arrakis to manage the political situation that the 2 years of post-assault governance had produced, the complications, the Fremen problems, the spice production issues that the Harkonnen governance was struggling with. The Emperor was there in the Arrakeen command structure when the Fremen assault overwhelmed the defences and produced the political confrontation that would end the dynasty. The confrontation was Paul's demand. Paul, at the head of a victorious Fremen army, in possession of the military capability that the battle had demonstrated, in control of the planet that produced the substance the civilization depended on, made his terms the throne. The Corrino dynasty would end. Paul would become the emperor. The terms were not negotiable in any practical sense. Paul had the military capability to enforce them. Had the prescient vision to see the alternatives and their consequences, had the political position that the victory and the Fremen's religious devotion provided. The terms also included a marriage. Paul would take Shaddam's daughter Irulan as his wife, the political marriage that provided the dynastic continuity the Landsraad's political culture required. The marriage was political rather than personal. Paul's emotional attachment was to Chani, the Fremen woman who had been his partner in the desert. Irulan was the political instrument, the Corrino princess whose marriage to the new emperor provided the dynastic bridge between the old regime and the new. Shaddam accepted the terms. The acceptance was not willing. The emperor did not choose to end the dynasty. The acceptance was the recognition of a reality that the emperor's political training enabled him to see clearly. The military situation was settled. The political situation was determined by the military situation. And the alternative to acceptance was the destruction of the Corrino house, rather than simply the end of the Corrino dynasty. The acceptance preserved the house. Shaddam and his household were not destroyed. They were displaced, removed from the throne, but permitted to continue existing as a noble house within the political order that Paul's ascension established. The dynasty ended. The house continued. The distinction mattered for the Corrinos' institutional future, but did not change the fundamental fact. 10,000 years of unbroken rule, sustained through the most sophisticated institutional management the species had produced, ended in an afternoon because the management had failed to account for one variable the intelligence had not assessed. The reasons for the fall deserve sustained examination because the fall was not the result of a single error, but of a structural failure that the dynasty's institutional culture had produced over centuries of successful governance. The structural failure was overconfidence. Not the personal overconfidence of Shaddam IV, though Shaddam was overconfident, as any person would be who had inherited and maintained the most powerful political position in the known universe for decades. The institutional overconfidence of a dynasty that had been successful for so long that the success had become, in the institutional culture's assessment, a permanent condition rather than a maintained one. The distinction is important. A maintained condition requires continuous effort, the ongoing investment of attention and resources in the management of the conditions that produce success. A permanent condition requires no effort. It exists because it exists, because the conditions that produced it are assumed to be self-sustaining, because the history of success is taken as evidence that the success will continue regardless of whether the effort that produced it continues. The Corrino dynasty's success had been a maintained condition for its first several thousand years. The early Corrino emperors, the rulers who had established and consolidated the dynasty's position in the centuries after the Battle of Corrine, had maintained the success through the deliberate, sustained effort that the position required. They had managed the Sardaukar with attention. They had managed the Landsraad's political dynamics with care. They had managed the Chom framework with the economic sophistication that the framework's complexity demanded. They had maintained the success because they had understood that the success required maintenance. The later Corrino emperors, and here the institutional history becomes difficult because the records that would document the progression across 10,000 years are not available in the detail the analysis would require, appear to have transitioned from the maintenance of success to the assumption of success. The institutional culture that had been organized around the continuous effort of maintenance evolved into an institutional culture organized around the management of an assumed permanent condition. The Sardaukar were maintained, but the attention to the conditions that produced the Sardaukar's capability, the environmental harshness of Salusa Secundus, the selection process that the harshness generated, the training that refined the selection's products, was less intense than it had been in the dynasty's earlier centuries. This erosion of attention, the gradual reduction in the effort invested in the conditions that produced the dynasty's military superiority, was the process that made the Sardaukar's defeat at Arrakis possible. The Sardaukar that the Fremen defeated at Arrakis were not the Sardaukar of the dynasty's peak, not the military force at its maximum capability. Maintained through the full attention of an institutional culture that understood the capability was fragile and required continuous investment. They were the Sardaukar of the dynasty's late period, still formidable, still the most capable conventional military force in the Imperium, but operating at a level that was below the historical peak because the institutional attention to the conditions of production had diminished. The Fremen exceeded this diminished Sardaukar, not because the Fremen's capability was unprecedented in the absolute, not because the Fremen were the most capable fighters the species had ever produced, though there may have been, because the Fremen's environmental conditions were more demanding than Salusa Secundus's diminished conditions, and the Fremen's selection process, the desert's filtration of the capable from the incapable, maintained across millennia of undiminished environmental harshness, had produced a military capability that the Sardaukar's diminished production process could not match. The Corrinos had been out-trained. The dynasty that had maintained its position for 10,000 years through the Sardaukar's military superiority had allowed the conditions of that superiority to erode, and the erosion had produced a gap between the Sardaukar's capability and the Fremen's capability that the battle for Arrakis exposed with devastating clarity. The intelligence failure and the military erosion were the immediate causes of the fall, but the deeper cause was the conspiracy itself, the decision to destroy House Atreides through the mechanism that the conspiracy employed. The conspiracy was a violation, not simply a political violation, though it was that, a breach of the political framework that the dynasty's legitimacy depended on. A strategic violation, a departure from the institutional strategy that had sustained the dynasty for 10,000 years. The Corrino strategy had been management. For 10 millennia, the dynasty had managed the political landscape, had used the Sardaukar's capability and the Chom framework and the administrative authority of the throne to manage the Landsraad's dynamics without eliminating the actors whose management the dynamics required. The management was subtle. The management was sustained. The management was the institutional art form that the Corrino political tradition had developed across centuries of practice, and that the dynasty's durability was the evidence of. The conspiracy against the Atreides was not management. It was elimination, the destruction of a political actor rather than the management of one. The distinction mattered because the two approaches produced different consequences. Management preserved the political landscape's structure, kept the actors in play, kept the dynamics manageable, kept the conditions that the dynasty's position depended on stable. Elimination destroyed the landscape structure, removed an actor, disrupted the dynamics, changed the conditions in ways that the management's tools were not designed to address. Shaddam chose elimination because the management's tools seemed insufficient. The Atreides' political position, the admiration, the respect, the judgment that the Atreides tradition represented a superior alternative to the Corrino tradition was not a threat that the management's tools could address. You could not manage a house's quality. You could not negotiate away a duke's integrity. You could not use the Sardaukar to reduce a house's reputation. The threat was the house itself, the existence of a house whose qualities made the Landsraad question the dynasty's fitness to rule, and the only response to an existential threat was elimination. The calculation was wrong. Not in its assessment of the threat. The Atreides' political position was threatening, and Shaddam's analysis of the threat's nature was accurate. In its assessment of the consequences, the calculation assumed that the Atreides' elimination would resolve the threat without producing consequences that exceeded the threat's cost. The assumption was wrong, because the calculation did not include the variable that the Fremen's unassessed capability represented. The dynasty fell because Shaddam broke the strategy that had sustained the dynasty for 10,000 years. The strategy said, manage. The situation said, the management tools are insufficient. The Emperor said, eliminate. And the elimination produced consequences that the 10,000-year strategy of management had never generated, because the strategy of management had never produced the conditions under which an unassessed variable could destroy the dynasty's position. The management strategy would have tolerated the Atreides' political position, would have accommodated it, contained it, worked around it through the patient, sustained indirect methods that 10,000 years of practice had refined. The management strategy would not have placed the Atreides on Arrakis, would not have deployed the Sardaukar in disguise, would not have created the conditions under which Paul Atreides and the Fremen could develop the capability that destroyed the dynasty. Shaddam's departure from the strategy was the departure that ended the dynasty. Not Paul's capability, not the Fremen's military superiority, not the prescient vision or the religious fervour or the sandworm cavalry. The departure from the 10,000-year strategy of management, the decision to eliminate rather than manage, was the decision that produced the conditions for everything that followed. The dynasty's fall was self-inflicted. Princess Irulan Corrino was the dynasty's most consequential figure after Shaddam IV, and her role in the post-fall period illuminated both the dynasty's institutional character and the specific form of endurance that the Corrino tradition produced in the face of the dynasty's displacement. Irulan was Bene Gesserit trained. This is the first and most important thing to understand about her, because the training shaped everything she did and everything she was capable of in the role that Paul's political settlement assigned her. The sisterhood had trained Shaddam's daughters, had placed its training infrastructure inside the Corrino household with the same thoroughness it brought to every noble house whose genetics the breeding program was managing. Irulan had the Prana Bindu disciplines. She had the observational capabilities. She had the body-mind integration that the Bene Gesserit training produced. She had the intellectual framework that the training's analytical dimension provided. She was also a writer. This is the detail that the political narrative sometimes overlooks, but that the texts present as a significant dimension of Irulan's character and of the Corrino institutional culture that had produced her. Irulan wrote histories, wrote the accounts of the events she was witnessing, the political transitions she was participating in, the era whose transformation she was positioned to document from the inside. The writing was not simply personal expression. It was institutional, the Corrino tradition's practice of documenting its own history, of creating the records that would sustain the dynasty's self-understanding across the generations, applied to the circumstances that the dynasty's displacement had produced. Paul married Irulan for political purposes that served his position rather than the Corrino house's interests. The marriage was a bridge, the institutional mechanism that provided dynastic continuity between the old regime and the new, that gave Paul's claim to the throne the legitimacy that the Corrino connection provided. That maintained the political fiction of succession rather than conquest that the Landsraad's political culture required. Irulan's position in Paul's court was the position of a political instrument rather than a political partner. Paul did not love her. Paul's emotional attachment was to Chani, the Fremen woman whose companionship in the desert had produced the bond that the political marriage with Irulan could not replicate. Irulan was present in the court. She was visible. She was the emperor's wife in the political sense that the title carried. She was not the emperor's partner in any sense that the word partner implied. The marginalization was painful. The texts document this with the attention that Irulan's experience deserved, the sustained discomfort of a person whose training and whose capabilities equipped her for political participation at the highest level, who was positioned in the court at the highest level, who was not permitted to participate at the level her capabilities and her position warranted, because the person whose court she inhabited did not value her participation. Irulan's response to the marginalization was the response that the Bene Gesserit training had prepared her for, and that the Corrino institutional culture supported. She waited. She observed. She documented. She maintained the Corrino institutional identity, the self-understanding, the institutional memory, the sense of the house as a living entity with a history and a future. Through the practice of recording what was happening and of maintaining the connections that the house's institutional survival required. She also acted. Irulan administered contraceptive drugs to Chani, prevented the conception that would produce the next generation of the Atreides genetic line, maintained the conditions under which no heir from Chani's body displaced the political significance that Irulan's position as Paul's wife provided. The action aligned with the Bene Gesserit's interest in maintaining influence over the breeding program's genetic output, but the action was Irulan's, motivated by the convergence of her own interest in preserving her political relevance with the institutional interests of the sisterhood that had trained her, and conducted within the context of the broader conspiracy against Paul that involved the Bene Tleilax, the Spacing Guild navigator Edric, and Irulan herself. Irulan's participation in the conspiracy, the alliance with the Guild and the Tleilax against the Emperor she was married to, was the action that most directly expressed the tension between her Corrino institutional identity and her position in Paul's court. The conspiracy was not a Corrino operation. It was not a Bene Gesserit operation. It was Irulan's personal response to the political position the post-fall settlement had placed her in, the response of a trained, capable, marginalized woman whose institutional loyalties were divided and whose personal interests were served by the conspiracy's objectives. The compliance was discovered. The discovery's consequences were political rather than criminal. Paul's response to the discovery was the response of a political operator managing a betrayal within his court, rather than the response of a husband discovering that his wife had been interfering with his concubine's fertility. The response was calculated. The response was contained within the political framework that Paul's governance maintained. The response did not produce the dramatic punishment that the betrayal's severity might have suggested, because the political calculation determined that the maintenance of the Corrino connection that Irulan represented was more valuable than the satisfaction of punishing the betrayal. Irulan survived the discovery. She survived it because she was useful, because the political instrument that she represented was still valuable to the political framework that Paul's governance required, because the Corrino connection was still worth maintaining even after the trust that the connection depended on had been compromised. She survived it because the Bene Gesserit training had given her the resilience that survival under these conditions required, the capacity to endure the diminished trust, the increased surveillance, the narrowed room for independent action that the discovery's consequences produced. The Corrino house, after the fall, occupied a position in the Imperium's political landscape that was simultaneously diminished and persistent. Diminished because the throne was gone. Persistent because the house's institutional existence continued in the forms that the post-fall political settlement permitted. Shaddam went to Seleucia Secundus. The irony was not accidental. The former emperor was sent to the prison planet that had been the Corrino dynasty's most important military asset, the world whose harsh conditions had produced the Sardaukar who had maintained the dynasty's position for 10,000 years. The prison planet became the prison of the dynasty's last ruler, the conditions that had been the dynasty's instrument of power becoming the conditions of the dynasty's exile. The exile was not comfortable. Seleucia Secundus was not a pleasant world. The environmental harshness that made it effective as a training ground for soldiers made it harsh as a residence for a displaced emperor and his household. The conditions were not the deliberately imposed punishment of a conqueror. Paul did not sentence Shaddam to suffer on Seleucia Secundus. The conditions were the natural environment of a planet that had been selected as a prison world precisely because the natural environment was harsh enough to serve as the Sardaukar's selection filter. Shaddam maintained the Corrino household on Seleucia Secundus with the institutional discipline that the dynasty's tradition demanded. The household continued to operate, the retainers continued to serve, the administrative functions continued to function, The institutional culture continued to maintain itself in the reduced circumstances that the exile imposed. The household was diminished, but not destroyed. The house was displaced, but not dissolved. The institutional identity that 10,000 years of governance had produced did not evaporate when the governance ended. It persisted in the forms available to it, in the conditions the exile provided. The persistence was characteristic of the Corrino institutional culture. The dynasty had maintained itself across 10,000 years of political complexity, had sustained its position through crises and transitions and the accumulated challenges that 10 millennia of governance inevitably generated. The institutional culture that had sustained the dynasty through those challenges was not eliminated by the loss of the throne. The culture was deeper than the throne, was embedded in the house's practices, its self-understanding, its relationship with its own history, its sense of itself as an institution with a mission rather than simply an organization with a position. The mission in the post-fall period was survival, not the survival of power. The power was gone. And the Corrino institutional culture was realistic enough to recognize that the recovery of the throne was not a near-term possibility. The survival of the house, the maintenance of the institutional identity, the preservation of the Corrino tradition's accumulated knowledge, the sustenance of the house's membership through the exile's conditions, the preparation for whatever future the changing political landscape might eventually provide. The Corrino house's relationship with the regency, the post-Paul governance that Alia conducted during the interregnum between Paul's desert walk and the twins' assumption of authority, was managed with the careful attention that the house's diminished position required, and that the institutional culture's political experience informed. The regency was not the Corrino house's friend. Alia's governance was the continuation of the political order that had displaced the Corrinos, and the regency's institutional interests did not include the restoration of the Corrino position. But the regency was also not the Corrino house's enemy in the active sense. Alia's governance had sufficient challenges without adding the management of a displaced dynasty to the list. And the political landscape's dynamics did not require the regency to invest effort in the further diminishment of a house that the loss of the throne had already reduced to political insignificance. The relationship was one of managed irrelevance. The Corrinos existed. The Corrinos were managed. The Corrinos were permitted to maintain their institutional identity within the constraints that the regency's governance imposed. The management was not punitive, but it was not generous. It was the baseline accommodation that the political system provided for displaced houses that were not actively threatening the current order. Inimima's marriage to Farad'n Corrino was the event that changed the relationship from managed irrelevance to political significance. The marriage was arranged in the context of the political crisis that the Children of Dune period produced, the crisis of Alia's deterioration, the twins' prescient awareness of the political landscape's instability, the need for a political arrangement that would stabilize the dynastic succession in the context of the uncertainties the crisis was generating. Farad'n was Shaddam's grandson, the Corrino heir whose position in the house's internal hierarchy made him the representative of the Corrino future. The marriage of Farad to Ganima was the merger of the two houses' bloodlines, the Atreides and the Corrino combined in the children that the marriage would produce, the dynastic rivalry resolved through the biological mechanism that the Imperium's political culture had developed for the resolution of inter-house conflicts. The merger was not a restoration. The marriage did not restore the Corrino dynasty to the throne. It incorporated the Corrino bloodline into the Atreides line, absorbed the Corrino genetics into the genetic heritage that the Atreides tradition would carry forward, Combined, the two houses' biological contributions in the children that would represent both houses' futures. The Corrino house contributed its genetics to the Atreides line. The Atreides line absorbed the contribution. The result was an Atreides line that carried Corrino blood, not a Corrino restoration, but a Corrino incorporation. Farad'n accepted this arrangement with the pragmatism that the Corrino institutional culture had developed across millennia of political management. The arrangement was not ideal. No displaced house's heir would choose incorporation over restoration if the choice were available. The arrangement was the best available, the alternative to incorporation was continued irrelevance, and the Corrino institutional culture's pragmatism said that incorporation into the ruling line was preferable to indefinite exile on a prison planet. The arrangement was also genuine, in the personal dimension. The text suggests that the relationship between Ganimar and Farad developed a personal quality that exceeded the political calculation, that the marriage, while arranged for political purposes, produced a bond between the two people involved that was more than the arrangement's political dimension required. Farad'n was a person of quality, intelligent, educated, capable of the kind of assessment and adaptation that the Corrino institutional culture at its best produced. Ganimar was a person of depth, carrying the ancestral presences of other memory, equipped with capabilities that exceeded what any previous Corrino spouse had encountered. The God Emperor's management of the Corrino legacy was conducted within the comprehensive management framework that Leto II applied to every element of the Imperium's institutional landscape. The Corrino house continued to exist during the God Emperor period. The house maintained its identity, the name, the traditions, the institutional practices that the millennia of dynastic governance had developed. The house maintained its membership, the people who carried the Corrino name, and the Corrino institutional identity continued to exist as a distinguishable community within the managed civilization that the God Emperor administered. The house did not maintain its power. The God Emperor's management of the Imperium's political landscape left no space for the kind of independent institutional power that the pre-fall Corrino house had wielded. The house existed as a managed entity, permitted, accommodated, maintained within the framework the God Emperor's governance defined, but not as a political force. This was the condition that every institution in the Imperium shared during the God Emperor period. The Corrino house was not singled out for diminishment. The Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, the Landsraad's other noble houses, every institution that had previously operated with some degree of independent authority was similarly managed under the God Emperor's comprehensive governance. The Corrinos were managed along with everyone else. The management was not personal, it was structural, the product of a governance system that left no space for independent institutional power of any kind. The Corrino House's institutional response to the management was the institutional response that 10,000 years of governance had refined. Patience. The House waited. The House maintained. The House preserved what could be preserved under the conditions the management imposed. The House's institutional culture, the practices, the self-understanding, the sense of mission that had sustained the dynasty across millennia continued to operate in the forms available under the managed conditions. The patience was the Corrino tradition's most durable quality. The trait that had sustained the dynasty across 10,000 years of political complexity, the capacity for sustained institutional operation across timescales that exceeded individual lifetimes, was the trait that sustained the House's institutional identity across the 3,500 years of the God Emperor's management. The House waited because waiting was what the House was best at. The House maintained because maintenance was what the House had been doing for 10,000 years before the God Emperor's management was imposed. The Corrino house's institutional culture across the 10,000-year dynasty deserves deeper examination, because the culture was the thing that produced the dynasty's durability and the thing that eventually contributed to the dynasty's fall. The culture was hierarchical. The Corrino house was organized around the emperor, the single figure whose authority constituted the house's institutional identity and whose decisions constituted the house's institutional direction. The hierarchy was not bureaucratic, was not the impersonal hierarchy of an administrative system that operated through rules and procedures rather than through personal authority. It was personal, organized around the person of the emperor, shaped by the emperor's qualities, responsive to the emperor's direction in the immediate way that personal authority rather than institutional process produced. This personal hierarchy produced both the dynasty's greatest strength and its greatest vulnerability. The strength was responsiveness, the capacity for rapid, decisive action that a personal hierarchy provided. When the emperor decided, the decision was implemented with the speed that the hierarchy's personal character permitted, without the delays of institutional deliberation, without the complications of consensus building, without the friction that impersonal hierarchies generated through the process of translating a decision from the decision-maker through the institutional machinery to the implementers. The vulnerability was dependence. The hierarchy's functioning depended on the quality of the person at its center. A competent emperor produced competent governance. An incompetent emperor produced incompetent governance. The hierarchy had no mechanism for compensating for the emperor's limitations, no institutional check on the emperor's judgment that could correct for the errors that any individual's judgment inevitably produced. The dynasty's 10,000-year duration suggests that the mechanism for managing this vulnerability was not institutional but dynastic, that the management of the succession, the training of the heirs, the institutional culture's transmission of the governance tradition from one generation to the next was sufficient to produce a long-run average quality of governance that the political system could sustain. Not every emperor was excellent, not every emperor was competent, but the average quality across the centuries and the millennia was sufficient for the dynasty's continuation, sufficient for the tripod's balance to be maintained, for the Sardaukar's capability to be sustained, for the Chom framework's economic relationships to be managed. The training of heirs was the dynasty's most important internal function. The emperor's children, the potential successors whose governance would determine the dynasty's future, were educated in the political, military, and institutional knowledge that the governance required. The education was comprehensive, covering the Sardaukar's management, the Chom framework's economics, the Landsraad's political dynamics, the administrative systems that the imperial government maintained. The education was also practical. The heirs were exposed to the governance's operational dimension through supervised participation in the decisions and the processes that the governance generated. The training was not always successful. The dynasty's 10,000-year history included emperors whose governance was poor despite the training, whose personal qualities or whose circumstances or whose responses to the pressures the position generated produced governance that diminished the dynasty's position rather than maintaining it. These poor emperors were managed through the institutional mechanisms that the dynasty had developed for managing the consequences of leadership failure, the advisors whose counsel could partially compensate for the leader's deficiencies, the institutional procedures that maintained the governance's basic functions regardless of the leader's quality, the political dynamics that produced the corrections that the poor governance's consequences required. Shaddam IV had received the training. His governance, for most of his reign, was competent. The management of the tripod's balance, the Sardaukar's deployment, the CHOAM framework's economics were conducted with the quality that the position required. The failure was not in the governance's ordinary dimension. The failure was in the extraordinary dimension, the response to a threat that the ordinary governance's tools could not manage, the decision to depart from the 10,000-year strategy of management in response to a situation that the departure was designed to resolve. The training had prepared Shaddam for the ordinary. The training had not prepared him for the pressure to depart from the ordinary, the pressure of a threat that the ordinary tools could not address, the temptation of a solution that required the departure from the strategy that the ordinary tools were the expression of. The training said, manage. The situation said, the management tools are not sufficient. The departure from the training's guidance was the departure that produced the fall. The Corrino dynasty's relationship with the other noble houses of the Landsraad was the political dimension that most thoroughly determined the dynasty's position across the 10,000-year reign. And examining the relationship illuminates both the dynasty's institutional competence and the institutional blind spots that the competence could not address. The Landsraad was not a parliament. The term is sometimes used in descriptions of the Imperium's political structure, but the analogy is misleading because the Landsraad's function was different from a parliament's function in ways that matter for understanding the dynasty's relationship with it. A parliament represented a population. The Landsraad represented houses, noble families whose claims to their positions were hereditary rather than democratic, whose authority over the populations they governed was grounded in tradition and power rather than in the consent of the governed. The Landsraad was an assembly of rulers, not an assembly of representatives, and the political dynamics it generated were the dynamics of a community of peers rather than the dynamics of a representative body. The dynasty managed this community of peers through the tools that the Corrino political tradition had developed across the millennia: patronage, alliance, the management of interhouse rivalries, the deployment of the Sardaukar's implicit threat, the economic leverage that the CHOAM framework provided. The management was sustained, was the continuous, ongoing practice that each Corrino emperor inherited from the predecessor and transmitted to the successor, refined across generations by the accumulated experience of managing the most complex community of political actors that the species had produced. The Atreides were the anomaly. Most of the Landsraad's houses could be managed through the standard tools, through the patronage and the alliance and the rivalry management that the Corrino tradition had refined. The Atreides could not. Not because the Atreides were unmanageable in the administrative sense. Duke Leto was a reasonable political actor who could be negotiated with and who operated within the political system's established parameters. Because the Atreides represented something that the management tools could not address, a quality of governance that made the Landsraad question whether the dynasty's governance was the best available. The management tools could manage ambition, they could manage greed, they could manage rivalry, resentment, the ordinary political motivations that the noble houses' competition generated. The management tools could not manage admiration, could not reduce the Landsraad's respect for the Atreides tradition, could not diminish the assessment that the Atreides way was better, could not use patronage or alliance or the Sardaukar's threat to change the judgment that the Atreides' governance quality represented an alternative to the Corrino tradition that the Landsraad found attractive. This was the limitation that the dynasty's institutional competence could not address, and the limitation's existence was the thing that drove Shaddam to the departure from the strategy that produced the fall. The political mechanisms that the Corrino dynasty maintained across the 10,000-year reign were the most developed expression of governance as management that the human species had produced, and examining them illuminates what it actually took to hold an interstellar empire together for 10 millennia. The mechanisms were not dramatic. This is the first thing to understand about the Corrino governance, the thing that the dramatic events of the fall tend to obscure. For most of the 10,000 years, the governance was not producing dramatic events. The governance was producing stability, the sustained, unremarkable, continuously maintained condition of a political system that functioned without crisis, that managed its tensions without eruption, that administered its complexity without collapse. The stability was not the absence of effort, it was the product of effort, the continuous, sustained, institutionally maintained effort of managing the political system's dynamics with the attention that stability required. The management operated through several channels simultaneously. The fief system was the primary administrative mechanism. The Imperium's worlds were organized as fiefs, territories assigned to noble houses for governance, with the assignment managed by the Emperor, and the governance conducted according to the terms the assignment specified. The fief system distributed the administrative burden across the Landsraad's houses, each house governing its assigned territories, each house managing the populations and the resources and the economic activity that the territories contained, each house operating as the administrative unit that the Imperium's scale required. The Emperor managed the fief system through the assignment and reassignment of territories. This was the governance's most important regular function, the decision about which house governed which world, the assessment of which house's governance was adequate and which house's governance required the correction that reassignment represented. The management was continuous, not a periodic review, but an ongoing assessment, informed by the intelligence that the imperial government's administrative apparatus generated and by the political dynamics that the Landsraad's internal relationships produced. The Arrakis assignment was the fief system's most consequential element, because the spice production that the Arrakis governance managed was the most valuable economic activity in the known universe. The management of the Arrakis assignment was the Emperor's most important fief decision, and the decision was made with the attention to political consequence that the assignment's significance required. The Harkonnens held Arrakis for 80 years because their governance served the Emperor's political purposes, because the spice revenue they generated was adequate, because their political reliability was sufficient, because the conditions that their governance of the planet produced did not create problems that the Emperor's administrative apparatus was required to address. The taxation system was the economic mechanism that connected the fief governance to the imperial treasury. The houses that governed fiefs paid taxes to the Emperor. A percentage of the revenue that the fief governance generated collected through the Chom framework and administered through the imperial government's fiscal apparatus. The tax rate was a political variable set by negotiation between the Emperor and the Landsraad, adjusted across the centuries in response to the political dynamics that the negotiation produced. The taxation was the economic foundation of the Corrino dynasty's political operation. The imperial household's expenses, the Sardaukar's maintenance, the administrative apparatus's operation, the diplomatic and political activities that the governance's external dimension required were funded through the tax revenue that the fief system generated. The management of the tax system, the collection of adequate revenue without the excessive extraction that would have generated political resistance, was an ongoing institutional responsibility that the dynasty's fiscal administrators managed across the millennia. The diplomatic apparatus was the political mechanism that managed the Landsraad's internal dynamics at the level of inter-house relationships. The imperial court, the social and political institution that surrounded the emperor and that served as the arena for the Imperium's most consequential political interactions, was the forum in which the diplomatic apparatus operated. The court received the Landsraad's representatives, facilitated the negotiations that inter-house relationships required, provided the social setting in which the political dynamics that the Imperium's complexity generated could be managed without the military confrontations that unmanaged dynamics might have produced. The court was the dynasty's most visible institutional practice, and the practice's management was an art form that the Corrino tradition had developed across centuries. The court's social dynamics, the precedents, the protocols, the rituals, and the ceremonies that the court's calendar included were not simply decorative. They were functional. The mechanisms through which the political hierarchy was expressed and maintained, through which the relationships between houses were displayed and negotiated, through which the emperor's authority was demonstrated, and the house's positions were acknowledged. The Sardaukar's cultural dimension, the institutional culture that the military force developed across the millennia of its existence, deserves attention beyond the purely military assessment, because the culture was the thing that sustained the force's capability across timescales that exceeded any individual soldier's service. The Sardaukar culture was a warrior culture, not in the romanticized sense that the term sometimes carried, not the culture of the noble warrior whose combat was an expression of honor and whose violence was constrained by the codes that the warrior tradition maintained. The Sardaukar culture was the culture of a military force that existed to enforce, whose function was the application of force in service of the authority that maintained it, whose identity was organized around the capability for violence that the force's training and selection produced. The culture was demanding. The training that followed the environmental selection on Seleucia Secundus was maintained at levels of intensity that would have been excessive by the standards of most military traditions, and the intensity was sustained across the soldiers' careers rather than being concentrated in an initial training period that the subsequent service was less demanding than. The Sardaukar were trained continuously, were maintained at combat readiness through the ongoing practice that the force's institutional culture required and that the force's deployment protocols demanded. The culture was also isolated. The Sardaukar were not part of the Imperium's broader social landscape. They were a separate community, maintained in conditions that kept them distinct from the civilian population and from the other military forces that the Landsraad's houses maintained. The isolation was functional. It preserved the force's capability by preventing the dilution that integration with less demanding social environments would have produced. The isolation was also cultural. It produced, in the Sardaukar, a sense of identity that was organized around the force rather than around the broader civilization, a self-understanding that said, "We are Sardaukar, and what we are is different from what everyone else is." The self-understanding was reinforced by the force's demonstrated capability. The Sardaukar knew they were the best, knew, through the combat experience that the force's deployments provided and through the institutional memory that the force's culture maintained, that their capability exceeded what any other military force in the Imperium could produce. The knowledge was not arrogance. It was the accurate assessment of a force whose training and selection had been designed to produce the maximum possible combat capability, and whose performance in the field had consistently confirmed the design's success. The erosion of this self-understanding is the thing that the dynasty's late period produced, and that the battle for Arrakis exposed. The erosion was subtle, not the sudden collapse of capability that a dramatic failure would have produced, but the gradual degradation that the reduced institutional attention generated over centuries. The Sardaukar of the late period was still formidable. They were no longer supreme. The difference between formidable and supreme was the difference between a force that could prevail against any opponent it was designed to face, and a force that could be defeated by an opponent it was not designed to face. The Fremen were that opponent. The desert's conditions, more demanding than Seleucus Secundus's conditions in the late period, maintained without the institutional management that the prison planet's conditions required, had produced warriors whose individual capability exceeded the Sartaukar's individual capability by the margin that the environmental difference produced. The Sartaukar's institutional culture, which had been organized around the self-understanding of supremacy, encountered at Arrakis the reality that the supremacy was no longer valid, and the encounter was devastating not only to the force's military position, but to the institutional culture's identity. The Corrino dynasty's relationship with technology was shaped by the Butlerian Jihad's legacy in ways that affected the dynasty's governance across the full 10,000-year span. The Jihad's prohibition, "Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind," was the constitutional principle that the post-Jihad order was organized around, and the Emperor was the principle's primary enforcer. Not the only enforcer. The Landsraad's collective political culture and the Imperium's religious traditions also maintained the prohibition, but the primary one. The institution whose authority and whose military capability underwrote the prohibition's continued observance. The enforcement was not simple. The prohibition's language was interpretable. The likeness of a human mind was not a precisely defined concept, and the boundary between technologies that violated the prohibition and technologies that did not was a subject of ongoing debate across the Imperium's political and technological communities. The Ixians, in particular, pushed the boundary continuously, developing technologies that performed cognitive functions through mechanisms that the Ixian engineering tradition argued were not in the likeness of human minds, and that the prohibition's stricter interpreters argued were. The Emperor managed this boundary through the political mechanisms the throne controlled, the judicial interpretations of the prohibition's language, the regulatory frameworks that the imperial government maintained for the assessment of new technologies, the political pressure that the throne could bring to bear on houses and institutions whose technological development appeared to approach or exceed the prohibition's limits. The management was calibrated. The dynasty did not enforce the prohibition with absolute rigor. The enforcement was political rather than theological, informed by the practical assessment of what the prohibition's strict enforcement would cost, rather than by the doctrinal commitment to the prohibition's absolute observance. Technologies that approached the boundary but that served the Imperium's functional needs were tolerated. Technologies that crossed the boundary in ways that threatened the political order's stability were suppressed. The calibration reflected the Corrino tradition's characteristic pragmatism, the willingness to manage the prohibition's enforcement in response to the political landscape's requirements rather than applying the prohibition without regard to context. The mentats were the human solution to the prohibition's computational gap. The human computers, trained in the cognitive disciplines that replicated through biological capability, the computational functions that the thinking machines had provided, were the Imperium's institutional response to the absence of artificial intelligence. And the mentats' existence was part of the technological landscape that the prohibition had created. The dynasty employed mentats. The imperial household maintained mentats whose cognitive capabilities supported the governance's analytical requirements. The strategic assessment, the economic analysis, the political calculation that the administration of an interstellar empire demanded. The mentats served the dynasty as the thinking machines would have served it in a pre-jihad civilization, providing the computational support that the governance required through biological capability rather than through artificial intelligence. The Suk doctors were another element of the technological landscape that the dynasty managed. The Suk medical tradition maintained the highest standards of medical practice the Imperium produced, and the Suk conditioning, the psychological programming that guaranteed the doctors' loyalty to their patients, was the tradition's guarantee of reliability. The dynasty employed Suk doctors because the guarantee was the thing the dynasty's personal security required. The assurance that the person providing medical care to the emperor and the imperial household was conditioned against betrayal at the neurological level. The Yueh betrayal demonstrated the guarantee's limitation. The Suk conditioning's breaking, achieved through the exploitation of Yueh's emotional attachment to his wife rather than through the assault on the conditioning itself, was the revelation that the guarantee was conditional rather than absolute, that the conditioning could be circumvented by the application of pressure to the conditioned person's emotional vulnerabilities rather than to the conditioning's neurological architecture. The dynasty's response to this revelation was not documented in the texts. The fall of the dynasty occurred before the institutional response to the conditioning's demonstrated vulnerability could be developed. But the revelation's implications for the broader Imperium, the knowledge that the Suk guarantee was not absolute, that the conditioning could be broken under the right conditions, would have affected every institution in the Imperium that depended on the Suk tradition's reliability as a security measure. The Corrino dynasty's accumulation of power across the 10,000-year reign was not linear, was not the steady, progressive increase that the term accumulation might suggest. The dynasty's power fluctuated across the millennia, rising and falling in response to the political dynamics that the Imperium's complexity generated, maintaining a long-term average that was sufficient for the dynasty's continuation, but that included periods of greater and lesser power that the institutional management had to navigate. The periods of greater power were the periods in which the dynasty's institutional management was most effective. When the Sardaukar's capability was at its peak, when the Chom framework's economic relationships were most favorable to the throne, when the Landsraad's political dynamics produced conditions that the dynasty's management tools could exploit for institutional advantage. These periods were not permanent. The conditions that produced them changed, as all political conditions change, and the dynasty's power diminished as the favorable conditions evolved into less favorable ones. The periods of lesser power were the periods in which the dynasty's institutional management was tested, when the Sardaukar's capability was diminished by the conditions discussed earlier, when the Chom framework's economic relationships were less favorable. When the Landsraad's political dynamics produced challenges that the management tools struggled to address. These periods were survived through the institutional resilience that the dynasty's 10,000-year tradition had developed, through the patience, the adaptability, the capacity for sustained institutional operation under unfavorable conditions that the Corrino tradition had refined across centuries of practice. The dynasty's long-term trajectory was, in retrospect, one of gradual decline, a progression from the peak power of the early post-Corrin centuries toward the diminished power of the late period that Shaddam IV inherited. The decline was not uniform. It included periods of recovery and periods of accelerated diminishment, but the overall direction was downward, reflecting the institutional erosion that sustained governance without sufficient institutional renewal inevitably produced. The decline was masked by the dynasty's continued position. The emperor was still the emperor. The Sardaukar was still the Sardaukar. The Chom framework still gave the throne its economic leverage. The visible markers of the dynasty's power were unchanged, and the unchanged markers made the underlying decline invisible to observers who assessed the dynasty's position by the markers rather than by the conditions that the markers were supposed to reflect. Shaddam IV inherited a dynasty that looked stronger than it was. The visible markers, the throne, the Sardaukar, the Chom position, were intact. The underlying conditions, the Sardaukar's capability relative to other military forces, the economic relationship's favourability, the Landsraad's genuine respect for the dynasty's governance, were diminished. The gap between the appearance and the reality was the gap that Shaddam's political management had to navigate, and the gap was the thing that made the Atreides threat feel more urgent than a stronger dynasty would have found it. A dynasty at peak power would not have felt threatened by the Atreides' political position. A dynasty at peak power would have managed the admiration through the standard tools, would have co-opted the Atreides, would have incorporated the Atreides' governance quality into the dynasty's own practice, would have responded to the admiration by earning it rather than by eliminating its object. The dynasty at diminished power could not do this, could not earn the admiration, because the conditions that would have supported the earning were no longer available, could not co-opt the Atreides, because the co-optation would have required the kind of institutional strength the decline had eroded. The conspiracy was the response of a weakened dynasty to a threat that a strong dynasty could have managed. The weakness drove the departure from the strategy. The departure produced the fall. The fall was the consequence of the weakness, not of the threat. The Corrino dynasty's relationship with religion was managed through the same pragmatic framework that the dynasty applied to every other dimension of its governance. The Imperium was not secular. The Orange Catholic Bible, the ecumenical text that the post-jihad religious settlement had produced, was the spiritual foundation of the civilization's religious life, and the emperor's position included a religious dimension that complemented the political and military dimensions. The emperor was not a religious figure in the theocratic sense, was not the head of the religious institutions, was not the source of religious authority, was not the arbiter of religious doctrine. But the emperor's position was informed by the religious landscape. The throne's legitimacy included a religious component that the Orange Catholic Bible's traditions and the Imperium's spiritual culture contributed to. The dynasty managed the religious dimension with the same calibrated attention it brought to every other dimension of governance. The religious institutions were accommodated, their role in the Imperium's social life was acknowledged and supported. Their activities were facilitated through the administrative mechanisms that the imperial government maintained. Their leadership was treated with the respect that the institution's social significance warranted. The accommodation was not devotional. The Corrino tradition's relationship with religion was practical rather than spiritual. Informed by the assessment of what the religious institutions contributed to the political stability the dynasty maintained, rather than by genuine engagement with the spiritual content the institutions provided. The Bene Gesserit's religious activities, particularly the Missionaria Protectiva's installation of religious elements in susceptible populations, were managed within this framework. The dynasty was aware that the sisterhood engaged in religious activities that exceeded the spiritual dimension, that the Missionaria Protectiva served institutional purposes that the sisterhood did not publicize. The dynasty's response was the characteristic Corrino pragmatism: accommodate what could be accommodated, monitor what needed monitoring. Intervene only when the activity threatened the stability that the dynasty's governance required. The dynasty's pragmatic relationship with religion contributed to the fall in a dimension that the political analysis sometimes underestimates. The Fremen's religious faith, The conviction that the Lisan al-Ghaib would come, that the voice from the outer world would lead the people to their destiny, was a religious phenomenon that the dynasty's pragmatic management had not assessed with the attention it deserved. The faith was present in the Fremen community for generations before the events of Dune. The faith was the product of the Missionaria Protectiva's installation. The faith's potential as a political and military force, the capacity of the weaponized religious conviction to produce the kind of commitment that the Jihad would eventually demonstrate, was not included in the dynasty's assessment of the Arrakis situation. The failure to assess the Fremen's religious potential was another expression of the intelligence failure that the fall produced. The dynasty's pragmatic management of religion, the assessment of religious phenomena through the lens of their contribution to or threat to political stability, was not equipped to evaluate a religious conviction whose potential for disruption was latent rather than active. The Fremen's faith was quiet. The Fremen's faith was patient. The Fremen's faith was waiting for the person who would activate it. The dynasty's assessment, which was looking for active threats to stability rather than for latent potentials that the right activation could convert into threats, did not see what the faith was waiting for. Paul activated it. The activation produced the military and political force that the faith's latent potential contained. The dynasty, which had not assessed the potential, was not prepared for the force. The failure to prepare was the consequence of the failure to assess. The failure to assess was the consequence of the pragmatic framework's limitation, the limitation of a governance approach that could manage what it could see and that could not manage what its assessment framework was not designed to detect. The Corrino dynasty's 10,000-year duration places it in a category of longevity that invites comparison with the longest-lasting political institutions in human history, and the comparison illuminates both what the dynasty achieved and what the achievement cost. No real-world empire has lasted 10,000 years. The longest-lasting political institutions in the historical record, the Roman Empire in its various forms, the Chinese dynastic tradition's institutional continuity, the papacy's sustained institutional existence, lasted for centuries or at most a couple of millennia, not for the full 10,000 years that the Corrino dynasty maintained. The Corrino achievement exceeded anything the historical record documented. And the exceedance was not simply a matter of duration, but of scale. The dynasty governed not a region or a continent, but an interstellar civilization spanning hundreds of worlds. Herbert was interested in what such longevity would require, and what it would produce. This is the dimension of the Corrino story that transcends the narrative's dramatic requirements. The inquiry into the institutional conditions that sustained governance on a timescale that exceeded anything the historical record contained, and the inquiry into the institutional consequences that such sustained governance produced in the institution, in the governed, and in the relationship between the two. The conditions that sustained the dynasty were the conditions the saga documents, the Sardaukar's military supremacy, the Chom framework's economic management, the tripod architecture's political balance, the administrative apparatus's institutional competence, the training of heirs that transmitted the governance tradition across generations. These conditions were not permanent. They required maintenance. The maintenance required effort. The effort required institutional will, the sustained commitment of the dynasty's leadership and administrative apparatus to the continuous work of maintaining the conditions that maintained the dynasty. The consequences of the sustained governance were less visible than the conditions and more important for the saga's larger argument. The consequences were in the governed in the populations whose political experience across 10,000 years had been the experience of being administered by a single dynasty, whose political imagination had been shaped by 10 millennia of unbroken Corrino rule, whose capacity for conceiving alternatives to the existing order had been progressively diminished by the sheer duration of the order's existence. 10,000 years is a long time to be governed by one family. The duration had effects on the political culture that the governance produced, effects that the dynasty's institutional competence could maintain, but that the dynasty's institutional culture could not prevent. The political culture of the Imperium, the Landsraad's assumptions about how power was organized, the noble houses' understanding of their own positions, the population's relationship with the authority that governed them, was shaped by 10 millennia of Corrino rule to such a degree that the political culture and the Corrino rule were difficult to distinguish. This was both the dynasty's achievement and its limitation. The achievement was stability, the sustained political order that the 10,000-year rule produced. The predictability that allowed the civilization's economic and social institutions to develop within a framework whose parameters were known and whose continuation was assumed. The limitation was rigidity, the reduced capacity for political innovation that the sustained stability produced. The diminished willingness to experiment with alternative arrangements that the existing arrangement's 10,000-year track record made seem unnecessary. The Atreides threatened the rigidity by demonstrating that an alternative was possible. Duke Leto's governance, principled, service-oriented, conducted with the integrity that the Corrino tradition's pragmatism did not prioritize, was the demonstration that the political landscape could accommodate a different kind of governance, and that the different kind could be, by the assessment of the people who experienced it, superior to the existing kind. The dynasty's response to this demonstration, elimination rather than accommodation, was the response of an institution whose rigidity prevented the accommodation that the demonstration required. A more flexible dynasty would have responded differently, would have learned from the Atreides' success, would have incorporated the Atreides' governance qualities into the Corrino practice, would have used the admiration as feedback rather than treating it as a threat. The Corrino dynasty could not do this because the institutional culture that 10,000 years of successful governance had produced was not equipped for the incorporation of external innovations. This is the argument about institutional longevity that the Corrino story makes. Institutions that succeed for a very long time become the prisoners of their own success. The success produces the institutional culture. The institutional culture produces the institutional rigidity. The institutional rigidity prevents the adaptation that the changing environment requires. The institution falls not because the environment overwhelms it, but because the institution's own success produced rigidity prevents it from adapting to the environment's changes. The Corrino dynasty's management of information deserves attention because the management of information was, alongside the management of military force and economic leverage, the third pillar of the dynasty's institutional practice. The imperial intelligence apparatus was one of the Imperium's most sophisticated institutional operations, a network of agents, analysts, and information processing capabilities that provided the throne with the intelligence necessary for the governance of an interstellar civilization. The apparatus was old, had been developing since the dynasty's founding, had been refining its methods across the millennia of the dynasty's reign, had accumulated the institutional knowledge about intelligence gathering and analysis that only sustained practice across centuries could produce. The apparatus provided the throne with information about the Landsraad's internal dynamics, about the noble house's political maneuvering, about the commercial relationships that the CHOAM framework managed, about the military capabilities that the houses maintained, about the technological developments that the Imperium's engineering traditions produced. The information was comprehensive, covered every dimension of the political landscape that the governance's requirements identified as relevant, and the information was processed through the analytical framework that the imperial government's mentats and intelligence analysts maintained. The apparatus's limitation was the limitation of all intelligence operations. The information it provided was bounded by what it was designed to collect and by the analytical framework through which the collected information was processed. The apparatus was designed to collect information about the political landscape's conventional actors, the noble houses, the major institutions, the commercial relationships. The apparatus was not designed to collect information about populations that fell outside the conventional actors category. Populations like the Fremen, whose significance was not recognized by the analytical framework's assessment of what was important. The information deficit about the Fremen was the apparatus's most consequential failure, and the failure was structural rather than operational. The apparatus's operatives on Arrakis collected the information that the apparatus's design specified: the spice production data, the governance metrics, the security assessments that the planet's administration generated. The operatives did not collect the information that the apparatus's design did not specify: the Fremen's population size, their military capability, their organizational sophistication, their cultural cohesion, because the apparatus's design had not identified these as intelligence requirements. The failure was the product of the same institutional blind spot that produced the conspiracy's intelligence failure: the assessment framework that could see the conventional and could not see the unconventional, that could assess what it was designed to assess, and that could not assess what its design did not encompass. The apparatus was competent within its design's boundaries. The apparatus was blind outside those boundaries, and the Fremen were outside those boundaries. The economic dimension of the Corrino dynasty's power, the wealth that the dynasty accumulated and deployed across the 10,000-year reign, was the dimension that most directly connected the throne to the daily life of the Imperium's populations. The imperial household was wealthy. The wealth derived from the tax revenue that the fief system generated, from the CHOAM shareholding that the throne's position entitled, from the economic relationships that the dynasty's political influence maintained, from the accumulated assets that 10,000 years of institutional operation had produced. The wealth was deployed in service of the dynasty's institutional requirements, the Sardaukar's maintenance, the administrative apparatus's operation, the court's functioning, the diplomatic activities that the governance's external dimension required. The wealth was also deployed as a political tool: the patronage that the throne provided, the economic benefits that the emperor could bestow on loyal houses, the economic consequences that the emperor could impose on disloyal ones, was the economic dimension of the political management that the Corrino tradition practiced. The patronage operated through the CHOAM framework. The commercial relationships that the emperor's CHOAM position allowed him to influence in ways that favored the houses whose loyalty the patronage was rewarding. The spice revenue was the wealth's most consequential component. The Arrakis fief's production, the melange that constituted the Imperium's most valuable commodity, generated revenue that exceeded what any other economic activity in the Imperium produced. The Emperor's share of the spice revenue collected through the taxation of the house that governed the Arrakis fief was the largest single item in the Imperial Treasury's income, and the economic foundation that the dynasty's institutional operations depended on. The dependency on the spice revenue was the economic dimension of the vulnerability that the dynasty's military dependency on the Sardaukar represented. Both dependencies, military and economic, were concentrated. The military capability depended on the Sardaukar, which depended on Seleucus Secundus's conditions. The economic capability depended on the spice revenue, which depended on the Arrakis governance. Each dependency was a concentration of risk, a single point where the disruption of the dependency's source would cascade through the institutional operations that the dependency sustained. Paul's threat to the spice, his willingness, demonstrated at the battle for Arrakine's political confrontation to destroy the spice production if his terms were not met, was the exploitation of the economic dependency. The threat worked because the dependency was total, because the disruption of the spice revenue would have been catastrophic for the institutional operations it funded. Because the cascade from the revenue's loss through the institutional operations' degradation to the dynasty's position's collapse would have been rapid and irreversible. The dynasty had not diversified. This is the economic dimension of the institutional rigidity that the dynasty's success had produced. A dynasty that was concerned about the spice revenue's concentration, that recognized the risk of depending on a single revenue source for the funding of the institutional operations the dynasty's position required, would have invested in the development of alternative revenue sources, in the diversification of the economic foundation that the institutional operations depended on. The Corrino dynasty had not done this. The spice revenue was sufficient. The sufficiency made the diversification seem unnecessary. The unnecessary became the undone. And the undone became the vulnerability that Paul's threat exploited. The Corrino dynasty's fall was, in Herbert's framing, not simply the end of a political arrangement, but the demonstration of a principle about the nature of empires and the conditions under which empires fail. The principle was this: empires fail from within, not from the external forces that the empire's military and political apparatus is designed to resist. The empire's institutional competence is sufficient for the management of external threats, which is why the empire has lasted as long as it has. From the internal conditions that the empire's own success has produced, the institutional rigidity, the intelligence blind spots, the dependency concentrations, the erosion of the capabilities that made the empire's success possible in the first place. The Corrino dynasty failed from within. The external threat, Paul the Fremen, the military capability that the desert had produced, was the instrument of the failure. But the conditions that made the instrument effective were internal: the Sardaukar's diminished capability, the intelligence apparatus's blind spots, the economic dependency's concentration, the institutional rigidity that prevented the adaptation the changing landscape required. These conditions were produced by the dynasty's own governance, by the success that had been maintained for so long that the maintenance had eroded the conditions it was supposed to sustain. This is Herbert's argument about empires, expressed through the Corrino dynasty's specific case, but applicable beyond the specific case to the general pattern of imperial decline. Empires rise through the development of institutional capabilities that exceed what the environment can resist. Empires sustain through the maintenance of those capabilities across the timescales that the environment's challenges require. Empires decline when the maintenance's quality diminishes, when the success that the capabilities produced makes the maintenance seem unnecessary, when the institutional culture that the success generated replaces the effort of maintenance with the assumption of permanence. Empires fall when the diminished capabilities encounter an environmental challenge that the undiminished capabilities would have managed, but that the diminished capabilities cannot. The fall is self-inflicted because the diminishment is self-produced. The environment does not diminish the empire's capabilities. The empire's own success diminishes them through the complacency that success generates, through the institutional rigidity that sustained success produces, through the erosion of the effort that the maintenance requires when the maintenance seems unnecessary because the success seems permanent. The Fremen did not defeat the Corrino dynasty. The Corrino dynasty defeated itself. The Fremen were the revelation of the defeat, the challenge that exposed the diminishment that the dynasty's success had produced, that demonstrated the gap between the dynasty's perceived capability and its actual capability, that made visible the internal conditions that the dynasty's institutional culture had rendered invisible. Paul was the person who exploited the gap. His prescient capability showed him the gap's existence, showed him the conditions under which the gap could be exploited, showed him the political and military configuration that would produce the exploitation's success. But the gap itself, the space between what the dynasty thought it was and what it actually was the dynasty's product, not Paul's. The dynasty's legacy in the post-fall Imperium was the legacy of an institution that had shaped the civilization so thoroughly that the civilization continued to operate within the frameworks the institution had created even after the institution's removal from the throne. The political framework persisted. The tripod architecture that the Corrino dynasty had administered for 10,000 years continued to function in modified form under Paul's governance and under the subsequent administrations that followed: the regency, the God Emperor's management, the post-God Emperor political landscape. The framework was modified. The balance of power among the legs was altered by each successive governance transition. But the basic architecture, the distribution of authority among the emperor, the Landsraad and the guild, survived the dynasty's fall. The economic framework persisted. The Chom structure continued to manage the Imperium's commercial relationships under the post-Corrino governance, with the modifications that the new political landscape required. The fief system continued. The taxation system continued. The economic relationships that the Corrino dynasty had administered for 10,000 years continued to function because the relationships were structural rather than personal. They were embedded in the Imperium's institutional fabric at a level that the change of dynasty did not affect. The military framework persisted, though in diminished form. The Sardaukar continued to exist after the dynasty's fall, continued as a military force, though the force's position was diminished by the defeat at Arrakis and by the political transition that followed. The Sardaukar were no longer the supreme military force in the Imperium. The Fremen held that distinction, but they remained a capable force, maintained by the Corrino house in its diminished position and available, in principle, for the deployments that the house's diminished circumstances might require. The institutional persistence was the Corrino dynasty's most durable legacy, more durable than the dynasty itself, more lasting than the 10,000-year reign. The frameworks that the dynasty had built continued to operate after the dynasty's removal, not because anyone chose to maintain them, but because the frameworks were so deeply embedded in the civilization's institutional fabric that removing them would have required a reconstruction of the civilization's basic operating systems that no subsequent governance had the capacity or the motivation to undertake. Paul governed within the Corrino frameworks. The God Emperor governed over the Corrino frameworks, modified them, managed them, subordinated them to his comprehensive governance, but did not replace them. The post-God Emperor governance operated in the remnants of the Corrino frameworks. 10,000 years of institutional construction had produced structures that outlasted the constructors by millennia. This persistence is the dynasty's most consequential achievement, And it is the achievement that the dramatic narrative of the fall sometimes obscures. The Corrino dynasty did not simply occupy the throne for 10,000 years. The dynasty built the civilization, constructed the institutional frameworks that the civilization operated within, developed the administrative systems that the governance of hundreds of worlds required, created the political architecture that made interstellar civilization governable. The dynasty's removal from the throne did not undo this construction. The construction persisted. The construction shaped the post-Corrino civilization as thoroughly as it had shaped the Corrino civilization. The construction was the dynasty's lasting contribution to the species' institutional development. The question that the Corrino dynasty's story raises, the question that Herbert embedded in the dynasty's 10,000-year arc, is the question of what sustained governance costs the governed. 10,000 years of Corrino rule produced stability. The stability produced the economic development, the cultural production, the institutional refinement that a civilization of the Imperium's scale and complexity required. The stability was, by most measures, beneficial. The alternative to stability was the kind of political disruption that the famine times after the god emperor's death demonstrated, the kind of chaos that the absence of sustained governance produced in the populations whose governance was disrupted. But the stability also produced rigidity. The rigidity was not simply institutional, it was not confined to the dynasty's own organizational culture. It was civilizational, extending through the political landscape to the populations whose political imagination the sustained governance had shaped. 10,000 years of being governed by one family produced, in the governed, a relationship with authority that was characterized by the acceptance of the existing arrangement as the only possible arrangement. The equation of the dynasty's governance with governance itself, the loss of the capacity to imagine what political life might look like without the dynasty at its center. The stability's cost was the governed population's political imagination. The governed could not imagine alternatives because the alternatives had never been available. The governed accepted the dynasty's governance not because the governance was optimal, but because the governance was the only thing the governed had ever known, because the 10,000-year duration had made the dynasty's position seem natural rather than contingent, permanent rather than maintained, inevitable rather than chosen. Paul's ascension disrupted this acceptance. The displacement of the dynasty demonstrated that the dynasty's position was not natural, was not inevitable, was not permanent. The position was maintained. The maintenance could fail. The failure could produce an alternative. The alternative did not have to look like the arrangement that the dynasty's governance had defined. The disruption was traumatic. The jihad that followed Paul's ascension, the interstellar war that the Fremen's weaponized faith produced, was partly the consequence of the governed population's response to the discovery that the political arrangement they had assumed was permanent was, in fact, contingent. The discovery produced disorientation. The disorientation produced the susceptibility to the religious fervor that the jihad mobilized. The fervor produced the violence. The dynasty's stability had not prepared the governed for the dynasty's removal. The stability had produced the acceptance that made the removal disorienting. The disorientation produced the susceptibility that the removal's aftermath exploited. The governed, who had been stable for 10,000 years, were destabilized by the removal of the thing that stability had been organized around, and the destabilization produced consequences that 10,000 years of stability had not equipped the governed to manage. This is the cost that the Corrino dynasty's story identifies. The cost of sustained stability is the governed population's reduced capacity for managing instability. The longer the stability lasts, the greater the capacity for instability management is diminished. The greater the diminishment, the more traumatic the eventual disruption is when it comes. And the disruption always comes. No political arrangement is permanent, no dynasty lasts forever, no stability is maintained indefinitely, which means that the cost of the stability is paid eventually, and the longer the payment is deferred, the higher the accumulated cost when the payment finally arrives. 10,000 years of stability. And then the Jihad. 61 billion dead. 90 worlds scarred. The accumulated cost of 10,000 years of deferred instability management capacity paid in a single generation. The Corrino dynasty did not cause the Jihad. The Jihad's causes were complex. Paul's prescient vision, the Fremen's religious fervour, the Missionaria Protectiva's manufactured faith, the political dynamics of the post-dynasty transition. The dynasty was not the cause. The dynasty was the condition, the 10,000 years of sustained governance that produced the populations whose political imagination was so thoroughly shaped by the dynasty's rule that the rule's removal produced the disorientation that the Jihad's mobilization exploited. The House Corrino, after the scattering, was the house reduced to its most essential element, the institutional memory. Everything else was gone. The throne was gone, had been gone for millennia, had been gone since Paul's afternoon in the desert. The Sardaukar were diminished to insignificance. The military force that had maintained the dynasty for 10,000 years was no longer the force it had been, was no longer the supreme military capability in the universe, was no longer the instrument that the dynasty's enforcement of political order required. The Chone position was diminished. The economic leverage that the shareholding had provided was reduced by the political transitions that the post-dynasty era had produced. The political position was diminished. The house was one house among many in a political landscape that was fragmenting rather than consolidating, that was dispersing rather than centralizing, that was evolving in directions that the dynasty's 10,000-year institutional experience was not designed to navigate. What remained was the memory, the institutional memory of 10,000 years of governance, the accumulated knowledge, the political experience, the institutional understanding that the dynasty's administration of the most complex political system in human history had produced. The memory was carried in the house's institutional culture, in the practices, the training, the self-understanding that the house maintained even after the conditions that had given the practices their purpose were gone. The memory was valuable. Not for the restoration of the dynasty, the political landscape of the post-scattering era did not include the conditions that the dynasty's restoration would have required. For the contribution the memory could make to whatever governance the future produced, the institutional knowledge of how to administer, how to manage political complexity, how to sustain institutional operations across timescales that exceeded individual lifetimes. Whether the contribution was made, whether the Corrino institutional memory was deployed in the service of the governance that the post-scattering future required, is a question the completed saga does not answer. The seventh novel that might have addressed the question was not written. The House Corrino's future, like the futures of the other institutions the saga created, remains in the territory that the completed text defined but did not fully explore. The Corrino dynasty was the most successful political institution in the history of the human species. 10,000 years, 400 generations, hundreds of worlds governed, trillions of people administered, the most complex political system in human history, maintained through the sustained effort of a single house's institutional operation. The dynasty was also the most comprehensive demonstration of the limitations of sustained governance that the species had produced. The rigidity that success generated, the intelligence blind spots that institutional culture created, the capability erosion that reduced maintenance produced, the dependency concentrations that undiversified institutional design accumulated, the institutional responses to threat that the institutional culture's rigidity prevented. The dynasty was both of these things simultaneously, the achievement and the limitation, the success and the vulnerability that the success produced, the 10,000-year record of institutional competence, and the single afternoon in which the competence's limitations were exposed. The rise was 10,000 years of sustained institutional effort maintained across 400 generations of leadership, producing the most durable political arrangement the species had known. The fall was an afternoon on a desert planet, where the governed rose against the governors, and the military that had sustained the governance was defeated by warriors the intelligence had not assessed, and the dynasty that had built the civilization was removed from the throne by a boy whose genetics, the dynasty's most important intelligence, had not tracked, and whose capabilities the dynasty's most important assessment had not measured. 10,000 years of rise. One afternoon of fall. The disproportion is the story's central image, the image that captures what the Corrino dynasty was and what the dynasty's experience demonstrates about the nature of institutional power and the conditions under which institutional power fails. The rise was sustained by effort. The fall was produced by the erosion of the effort. The erosion was produced by the success that the effort had achieved. The success made the effort seem unnecessary. The unnecessary effort was reduced. The reduction produced the conditions for the fall. And the fall, when it came, was swift enough that the duration of the rise made it seem impossible. 10,000 years. One afternoon, the most successful institution in human history ended by a variable the institution's intelligence apparatus had not assessed. The sandworms carried the desert warriors through the breached shield wall. The Sardaukar fell. The emperor capitulated. The dynasty ended. 10,000 years. One afternoon. The rise and the fall of House Corrino. The succession mechanics of the Corrino dynasty, the institutional processes that transmitted the governance from one emperor to the next across 400 generations, were among the dynasty's most consequential institutional innovations and deserve extended attention, because the succession was the mechanism through which the dynasty's longevity was achieved. A dynasty is not an individual. It is a sequence of individuals, each one inheriting the position from the predecessor and transmitting it to the successor, each one governing for the duration of their tenure and then being replaced by the next in the sequence. The dynasty's longevity is the product of the succession's reliability, the sustained capacity of the transmission mechanism to produce successors who are capable of the governance the position requires and who are prepared for the demands the position imposes. The Corrino succession was managed through the training apparatus that the dynasty maintained for the emperor's children. The training was comprehensive, covering the political, military, economic, and administrative dimensions of the governance the position required. The training was sustained, beginning in the heir's childhood and continuing through the decades of education and supervised experience that the preparation required. The training was institutional, maintained by the dynasty's educational apparatus rather than by the individual emperor, transmitted across generations through the institutional culture that the educational apparatus embodied. The heir was not always the firstborn. The Corrino succession tradition included the emperor's assessment of the heir's capabilities as a factor in the succession's determination. The recognition that the governance required qualities that not every child possessed, and that the succession's reliability depended on the selection of the heir whose capabilities best matched the position's requirements. The assessment was conducted by the emperor and by the advisors whose institutional knowledge of the governance's demands informed the assessment's criteria. This flexibility, the capacity to select the most capable heir rather than being bound by the rigid primogeniture that some dynastic traditions maintained, was one of the dynasty's institutional advantages. The flexibility allowed the dynasty to respond to the variation in heirs' capabilities that any succession across 400 generations inevitably produced. To select, from the available children, the person whose qualities the assessment identified as most compatible with the governance's demands. The flexibility also introduced risk. The selection process was political as well as meritocratic. The advisors who contributed to the assessment had their own institutional interests, and the assessment's criteria could be influenced by the advisors' institutional positions as well as by their judgment of the heir's capabilities. The succession could be politicized, could become the arena for institutional competition among the factions that the emperor's court contained, with each faction advocating for the heir whose succession would serve the faction's interests. The dynasty managed this risk through the same pragmatic approach it applied to every other political challenge: awareness, containment, and the calibration of the succession process to balance the meritocratic and the political dimensions of the selection. The management was not always successful. The dynasty's 10,000-year history presumably included successions that were more political than meritocratic, that produced emperors whose selection reflected institutional politics rather than governance capability. But the long-run average was sufficient. The succession produced, across 400 generations, enough capable emperors to sustain the dynasty's position. The Bene Gesserit's involvement in the succession was the dimension that the saga's narrative addresses most directly, because the sisterhood's breeding program was the external influence on the succession that the dynasty's own institutional management could not fully control. The Bene Gesserit placed trained women in the Corrino household. The wives and the concubines who produced the emperor's children were, in many cases, Bene Gesserit trained, carrying the sisterhood's genetic management agenda alongside whatever personal or political role the placement defined. The children produced by these placements were the products of both the dynasty's succession management and the sisterhood's breeding program, shaped by the Corrino training apparatus and by the genetics that the sisterhood's management had contributed. The dynasty was aware of the sisterhood's influence. The Corrino political tradition included the awareness that the Bene Gesserit's placements served the sisterhood's institutional purposes alongside whatever purposes the dynasty's own interests defined. The awareness was managed. The dynasty accommodated the sisterhood's influence within the framework that the political relationship between the throne and the sisterhood maintained. Accepting the Bene Gesserit's involvement in the succession as part of the political landscape's established dynamics. Shaddam IV's daughters, including Irilun, were the products of this dual management. Their genetics carried the Bene Gesserit's breeding program's contributions alongside the Corrino genetic heritage. Their training included the Bene Gesserit disciplines alongside the Corrino educational tradition. They were, in their persons, the convergence of the two institutional influences that had shaped the Corrino succession for millennia: the dynasty's own training apparatus and the sisterhood's genetic management program. The dynasty's specific management of individual Landsraad houses across the 10,000-year reign was conducted through the political mechanisms the governance provided, and examining the management's character illuminates the quality of the dynasty's institutional operation. The Landsraad contained hundreds of houses. Not all of them were major political actors. The Landsraad's membership included houses whose territories were small, whose resources were limited, whose political influence was proportional to the modest positions they occupied in the Imperium's landscape. The management of these minor houses was routine, conducted through the administrative mechanisms that the imperial government maintained for the fief system's operation, requiring no more than the ordinary attention that the governance's regular functions provided. The major houses, the Atreides, the Harkonnens, the Richets, the Ekaz, the Mauritani, and the other houses whose scale and capability made them significant actors in the Landsraad's political dynamics, required more than routine management. These houses had resources, they had military capability, they had political influence within the Landsraad's community, they had ambitions that the governance's management had to accommodate or contain or redirect. The dynasty's management of the major houses was conducted through the full range of the political mechanisms the throne controlled. Patronage, the bestowal of economic benefits that rewarded loyalty and that created the expectations of continued benefit that loyalty maintenance required. Alliance, the cultivation of political relationships with houses whose interests aligned with the dynasty's interests, producing coalitions that served the governance's purposes. Rivalry, the management of inter-house conflicts in ways that prevented any single house from accumulating enough power to threaten the dynasty's position while maintaining enough competition to keep the houses focused on each other rather than on the throne. The management of inter-house rivalries was the dynasty's most sophisticated political practice. The throne did not simply observe the rivalries, the throne managed them, calibrating the rivalries' intensity to serve the governance's purposes, escalating them when the political dynamics required the house's attention to be directed away from the throne's activities, de-escalating them when the rivalries' intensity threatened the stability that the governance maintained. The Atreides-Harkonnen rivalry was the most consequential of the managed rivalries, and the dynasty's management of it illustrates the practice at its most developed and its most revealing. The rivalry between the two houses was older than the dynasty's specific management of it, grounded in historical grievances and institutional enmities that predated the dynasty's involvement. The dynasty did not create the rivalry. The dynasty managed it, maintained it at an intensity that served the governance's purposes, preventing the resolution that would have eliminated a useful political dynamic while preventing the escalation that would have produced the kind of inter-house conflict that the governance's stability required the absence of. The management was conducted through the mechanisms of the fief system and the tome framework. The assignment of fiefs, the allocation of chome shares, the distribution of patronage, all of these were calibrated to maintain the rivalry at the desired intensity. The Harkonnens received the Arrakis fief, which gave them economic power that the Atreides could not match. The Atreides received the political respect of the Landsraad, which gave them political influence that the Harkonnens could not purchase. The balance maintained the rivalry. The rivalry served the governance. Shaddam's decision to eliminate the Atreides was the departure from this management, the decision to resolve the rivalry through the destruction of one of its participants rather than maintaining the rivalry's calibrated intensity. The departure was motivated by the fear that the Atreides' political position was becoming unmanageable through the standard mechanisms, that the admiration the Landsraad showed to the Atreides was a dynamic that the rivalry's management could not contain, and that the rivalry's management's tools could not address. The departure produced the fall. The management that had served the dynasty for millennia was abandoned in response to a situation that the management could not address, and the abandonment produced consequences that the management's continuation would not have generated. The dynasty fell not because the management failed, but because the dynasty abandoned the management, departed from the strategy that the management embodied, replaced the calibrated maintenance of the political landscape's dynamics with the elimination of one of the landscape's participants, and discovered that the elimination produced effects the management would have prevented. The Sartaukar's deployment history across the 10,000-year reign illuminates the dynasty's military strategy and the relationship between the military instrument and the political objectives the instrument served. The deployments were infrequent by design. The Sartaukar's political value was as much in the threat of deployment as in the deployment itself, and the dynasty's military strategy was organized around the principle that the threat was more useful than the action. That the Sardaukar's demonstrated capability, maintained through the occasional deployment that confirmed the capability's continuing reality, was a more effective political tool than the continuous deployment that would have consumed the capability's political capital without proportional return. The deployments that occurred were calibrated. Each deployment was assessed against the political return it would generate, the restoration of the political order that the deployment was designed to produce, the demonstration effect that the deployment's success would create for other potential challenges, the cost of the deployment in political capital and military capability against the benefit of the outcome the deployment achieved. The calibration was not always successful. The dynasty's 10,000-year history presumably included deployments whose costs exceeded their benefits, whose political returns were less than the political capital the deployment consumed, whose consequences included unintended effects that the pre-deployment assessment had not anticipated. These unsuccessful deployments were managed through the institutional mechanisms the dynasty maintained for the management of military consequences, the diplomatic follow-up, the political repair, the adjustment of the governance's approach in response to the deployment's failure. The deployments were also concealed when the political circumstances required concealment. The Sardaukar in Harkonnen livery, the disguised deployment that the Arrakis conspiracy employed, was not the dynasty's first use of concealed deployment. The institutional practice of deploying the Sardaukar under cover under the flags of allied houses, in circumstances that made the deployment invisible to the political landscape's observation, was a technique the dynasty had developed across the centuries of its military operations. The concealment was necessary because the deployment of the Emperor's military force against a Landsraad house was a political act that the tripod architecture's political framework did not sanction. The Emperor's authority included the maintenance of order, and the Sardaukar's deployment could be justified as the maintenance of order in circumstances where the political landscape accepted the justification. But the deployment against a specific house for the house's destruction was a different act, was the use of the Emperor's military monopoly against a member of the political community that the Emperor was supposed to be managing rather than attacking. The concealment addressed this political problem by making the deployment invisible, by disguising the Sardaukar as another house's forces. The dynasty could deploy its military capability without the political consequence of being seen deploying it. The technique worked as long as the concealment held. The technique's vulnerability was the vulnerability of all concealment. The risk that the disguise would be penetrated, that the deployment would be identified as imperial rather than inter-house, that the political consequence the concealment was designed to avoid would arrive despite the concealment. Paul penetrated the concealment. His prescient capability showed him the Sardaukar beneath the Harkonnen livery, showed him the Emperor's military force operating under the cover that the dynasty's concealment technique had provided. The penetration was the political dimension of Paul's challenge to the dynasty. The demonstration that the Emperor had deployed his military force against a Landsraad house under disguise. The revelation that the dynasty had violated the political framework's constraints. The exposure that converted the conspiracy from an inter-house conflict into a constitutional crisis. The exposure was devastating because the dynasty's legitimacy depended on the political framework's maintenance. The Emperor who was seen deploying the Sardaukar against a Landsraad house under disguise was the Emperor who had been caught violating the rules that the Emperor's legitimacy depended on maintaining. The revelation destroyed the political cover that the conspiracy's concealment had been designed to provide. The destruction of the cover made the dynasty vulnerable to the political consequences that the cover had been designed to prevent. The dynasty's relationship with its own mythology, the institutional narrative about the dynasty's founding, its purpose, and its legitimacy, was the cultural dimension of the governance that sustained the dynasty's position alongside the military and economic dimensions. The mythology began at Corrin. The Battle of Corrin, the military engagement that ended the Butlerian Jihad and that gave the house its name, was the founding narrative around which the dynasty's self-understanding was organized. The narrative said, the Corrinos led humanity to victory against the machines. The Corrinos earned the right to govern through the military leadership they provided in humanity's most important war. The governance that followed the victory was the continuation of the leadership that the victory had established. The narrative was accurate in its broad strokes and simplified in its details. The Battle of Corrin was a historical event. The Corrino leadership in the battle was real. The claim to the throne was grounded in the contribution the leadership represented. But the narrative's simplification, the reduction of a complex military and political history to the clean narrative of Corrino leadership and Corrino victory, was the institutional management of the history rather than the history itself. The dynasty maintained the mythology through the institutional practices that the governance included. The histories that the dynasty commissioned, the official accounts of the Imperium's history that the Emperor's historical apparatus produced, presented the dynasty's founding in the terms the mythology specified. The ceremonies and the rituals that the court maintained, the events that the court's calendar included, and that the political community's participation affirmed, reinforced the mythology's elements through the repetition that ritual provided. The mythology served a political function. It was not simply commemorative, not simply the celebration of a historical event that the dynasty was connected to. It was legitimating the continuous reassertion of the claim that the dynasty's governance was grounded in the historical contribution that the mythology described, the ongoing demonstration that the dynasty's authority was derived from the founding act rather than simply from the sustained possession of the throne. The legitimation was necessary because the dynasty's authority was, at bottom, maintained rather than natural. The throne was not the Corrinos' by right in any absolute sense. The throne was the Corrinos' because the post-Corrin settlement had established it and because the dynasty's institutional management had sustained it. The mythology provided the narrative that made the maintained authority feel natural. That converted the political arrangement into a historical destiny, the institutional management into the continuation of a founding purpose. The mythology's effectiveness depended on the distance between the mythology and the reality. When the mythology and the reality were aligned, when the dynasty's governance was competent, and the governed population's experience of the governance was compatible with the mythology's claims, the mythology's legitimating function was seamless. When the mythology and the reality diverged, when the governance was incompetent or corrupt or self-serving in ways that the mythology's claims about the dynasty's purpose did not accommodate, the divergence created the credibility gap that the legitimation could not bridge. Shaddam IV's reign ended in a credibility gap. The mythology said the Corrinos govern because the Corrinos earned the right to govern. The reality said the Corrinos conspired to destroy a noble house through disguised military force, violating the political framework that the mythology's legitimacy depended on maintaining. The gap between the mythology and the reality, the gap between the claimed purpose and the actual conduct, was the gap that Paul's challenge exploited. Paul did not need to attack the mythology directly. He needed only to make the reality visible. The reality, the Sardaukar in Harkonnen livery, the conspiracy against a Landsraad house, the violation of the political framework's constraints, spoke for itself. The mythology could not survive the reality's exposure. Because the mythology's legitimating function depended on the governed population's belief that the dynasty was what the mythology said it was, and the reality demonstrated that the dynasty was not what the mythology said it was. The dynasty fell when the mythology failed. The military defeat was the mechanism. The political confrontation was the context. But the fall's foundation was the mythology's collapse, the destruction of the narrative that had sustained the dynasty's legitimacy for 10,000 years, destroyed not by a superior narrative, but by the exposure of the reality that the mythology had been designed to conceal. The moment of the capitulation, the scene inside the Arrakis command structure, where Shaddam IV accepted Paul's terms, deserves sustained attention because the moment was the point at which 10,000 years of accumulated institutional authority was surrendered, and the surrender's quality reveals something about the dynasty and the man who was its last representative. Shaddam was not alone. The imperial household was present. The retainers, the advisors, the Sardaukar officers whose military hierarchy was subordinate to the emperor's authority. The members of the court whose political functions placed them in proximity to the emperor during the crisis the battle had produced. Irulan was present. The daughter whose marriage to Paul would constitute the dynastic bridge the political settlement required. The Bene Gesserit truth-sire was present, Gaius Helen Mophiam, whose institutional loyalty to the sisterhood complicated but did not eliminate her functional role in the emperor's court. Paul was present with his Fremen, the desert warriors whose capability had just demonstrated its superiority over the Sardaukar, the soldiers whose physical presence communicated, through their bearing and the visible evidence of their combat capability, the military reality the political discussion had to accommodate. The confrontation was not a negotiation. Negotiations implied bargaining positions, trades that could be offered and accepted, outcomes that both parties participated in determining. The confrontation was a demand, Paul's demand, backed by the military capability the Fremen had demonstrated and by the prescient vision that showed Paul the probability space within which the demand was being made. The demand was the throne. The terms were not adjustable. Shaddam assessed the demand with the political intelligence decades of governance had developed. The assessment was rapid, the military situation was clear, the political configuration was determined by the military situation, and the options available to the emperor were limited to the narrow range that military defeat typically produced for the defeated party. The assessment's conclusion was capitulation. Not because Shaddam wanted to capitulate, the emperor's personal dignity, the dynasty's institutional identity, the accumulated weight of 10,000 years of governance all resisted the conclusion. Because the alternative to capitulation was destruction, the elimination of the Corrino house itself, the removal of the family from the political landscape rather than simply the removal of the family from the throne. Capitulation preserved the house. Destruction ended it. The dynasty's institutional culture, the culture that had prioritized the house's survival across 10,000 years of governance challenges, produced the calculation that survival without the throne was preferable to destruction with whatever momentary dignity the resistance might have provided. Shaddam capitulated. The word is inadequate for the experience it describes. The experience of a person whose identity was organized around the position he was surrendering, whose self-understanding was inseparable from the authority he was relinquishing, whose assessment of his own significance was defined by the dynasty whose governance he was ending. The acceptance was conducted with the composure the Corrino tradition demanded. The dynasty's institutional culture included the management of appearance, the presentation of the emperor's person in the manner the position's dignity required, regardless of the circumstances the presentation was being made in. Shaddam maintained the composure. He accepted the terms, he agreed to the marriage, he agreed to the exile. He managed the capitulation with the institutional discipline the training had produced, and that the circumstances tested to their limits. The day-to-day governance the Corrino dynasty conducted for 10,000 years, the ordinary, unremarkable, continuously sustained operation of administering an interstellar civilization, is the dimension of the dynasty's story that the dramatic narrative of the fall obscures, but that the dynasty's actual achievement consisted of. The governance was administrative, the governance of hundreds of worlds, trillions of inhabitants, thousands of noble houses, and an economic system of staggering complexity was, in its daily reality, administrative, the continuous management of the systems and the relationships and the processes that the civilization's functioning required. The administration included the fief system's management, the ongoing assessment of noble houses' governance, the reassignment of fiefs when the assessment concluded that current governance was inadequate, the arbitration of interhouse disputes that fief boundaries sometimes generated. The administration included the tax system's operation, the collection of revenue, the allocation of collected revenue to imperial functions, the management of the economic relationships that taxation created between the throne and the governed houses. The administration included the judicial function, the adjudication of disputes that the political system's mechanisms could not resolve through negotiation, the interpretation of the laws and conventions the Great Convention had established. The judicial function was the dynasty's most visible expression of the authority the throne represented, the demonstration that the emperor's position included the capacity for final judgment in disputes the civilization generated. The administration was sustained through the institutional apparatus the dynasty had built across the millennia, the bureaucracy, the administrative class, the trained personnel whose capabilities supported the governance's requirements. The apparatus was old. The apparatus was capable. The apparatus was also conservative. The institutional culture that sustained the apparatus was the same culture that produced the governance's rigidity. The day-to-day governance was, for the populations who experienced it, the dynasty. The political drama of the court was invisible to the vast majority of the Imperium's inhabitants. What the inhabitants experienced was the governance, the tax collector, the judicial system. The administrative framework that organized their economic activities and adjudicated their disputes and maintained the political order within which their lives were conducted. The governance was, for most of the 10,000 years, adequate, not inspiring. The Corrino governance was not designed to inspire, was not organized around the provision of excellence, but around the maintenance of stability. Adequate, sufficient for the civilization's needs, sufficient for the population's requirements, sufficient for the political system's maintenance, without producing the kind of governance failure that would have generated political crisis. The adequacy was the dynasty's achievement, not the dramatic achievement of military victory or political innovation, the quiet, sustained, continuously maintained achievement of keeping an interstellar civilization functioning across 10,000 years. The dynasty's relationship with time, with the 10,000-year duration that constituted its most distinctive characteristic, was the dimension that made the Corrino experience different from any other governance experience in human history. Ordinary governance operated within the timescale of an individual ruler's reign. The ruler governed. The ruler aged. The ruler died or abdicated. The successor assumed the position. The governance continued, but the continuity was generational. Each ruler's governance bounded by the ruler's lifetime, the governance's trajectory shaped by the succession of individual rulers' decisions rather than by a continuous institutional consciousness. The Corrino dynasty operated within a different timescale. The dynasty's institutional consciousness, the accumulated knowledge, the institutional culture, the governance tradition transmitted from ruler to successor across the generations, was older than any individual ruler's experience. The institutional consciousness had been developing since the dynasty's founding, accumulating the knowledge and the practices 10,000 years of governance produced, refining the institutional culture through the sustained experience of managing the most complex political system in human history. Each emperor governed within this institutional consciousness. The individual ruler's decisions were informed by the accumulated knowledge the institutional tradition provided, the understanding of how the political landscape operated, the assessment of what the governance's tools could achieve, the experience of what had worked and what had not across the millennia. The individual ruler was not governing alone. The individual ruler was governing with the dynasty, with the accumulated institutional wisdom the dynasty's history had produced, and that the dynasty's educational apparatus transmitted to each new ruler. The relationship between the individual ruler and the institutional consciousness was the dynasty's most important internal dynamic. A ruler who engaged with the institutional consciousness, who absorbed the accumulated wisdom, who learned from the dynasty's historical experience, produced governance that benefited from the accumulated depth of 10,000 years. A ruler who disengaged from the institutional consciousness, who relied on personal judgment without reference to the institutional wisdom, produced governance that lacked the depth the institutional consciousness could have provided. Shaddam IV had engaged with the institutional consciousness throughout most of his reign. His governance reflected the accumulated wisdom the institutional tradition provided. The governance was competent. The governance was informed. The departure from the institutional consciousness occurred when the conditions exceeded what the wisdom could address. The Atreides threat was a condition the institutional consciousness had not previously confronted. The wisdom said, "Manage." The conditions said, "The management tools are insufficient." The departure from the wisdom was the departure that produced the fall. The departure was Shaddam's, not the dynasty's. The institutional consciousness, the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years, would not have endorsed the conspiracy. The wisdom said, manage, contain, accommodate, wait. The wisdom's patience, the patience of a tradition that had sustained itself across 10,000 years by managing rather than eliminating, would have counselled against the departure. Shaddam departed from the council. The departure was personal. The consequences were institutional. 10,000 years of institutional wisdom overridden by one ruler's fear. The dynasty sustained across 400 generations by the institutional consciousness's accumulated guidance was ended by one generation's departure from the guidance. The accumulated wisdom said wait. The individual fear said act. The individual acted. The dynasty fell. This is the final lesson of the House Corrino. Institutions are sustained by institutional wisdom, and institutions are destroyed when individuals override the institutional wisdom in response to pressures the individuals cannot manage. The wisdom is accumulated across centuries. The override occurs in a moment. The moment produces the consequences the centuries of accumulated wisdom existed to prevent. 10,000 years of wisdom. One moment of fear. The rise and the fall of House Corrino.